Chapter 1. How Self-Love Turns into a Trap. The Myth Behind Narcissism. To truly understand how modern psychology defines narcissism, it helps to slow down and travel far back in time to a story that was told long before psychiatry existed. Language itself often carries quiet wisdom, and in this case, the very origin of the word offers a powerful metaphor for the condition it describes. The term narcissism comes from the ancient Greek myth of Narcissus, a young hunter celebrated for his extraordinary beauty. According to the story, Narcissus rejected the affection of everyone who loved him, including the nymph Echo, who was left with nothing but her own fading voice. As punishment for his coldness and inability to truly connect, the goddess Nemesis caused Narcissus to fall in love with his own reflection in a pool of still water. At first glance, this tale is often told as a simple warning against vanity, but when we listen more closely, the story reveals something deeper and far more unsettling. Narcissus does not perish because he loves himself too much. He dies because he becomes trapped in a closed world of reflection. He cannot recognize that the image before him is not a living other, but only himself. He is unable to reach beyond the surface of the water, unable to receive anything from the outside world, and unable to give anything of himself in return. In this sense, Narcissus is imprisoned within his own perception, cut off from genuine exchange, relationship, and growth. This ancient image mirrors what modern psychology identifies as the core of pathological narcissism. At its heart lie two enduring features: an intense inward focus and a profound inability to relate to others as separate, autonomous beings. Relationships are not experienced as mutual connections, but as mirrors meant to reflect admiration back to the self. The figure of Echo deepens this symbolism. Stripped of her own voice, Echo exists only to repeat the words of others. In psychological terms, she represents what later theorists would call narcissistic supply, the people whose role is not to be fully seen or known, but to echo validation, praise, and attention. Echo has no independent presence in Narcissus's world, just as people in the narcissist's life are often valued only for how well they reinforce the narcissist's self-image. The Roman poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, preserved and popularized this story, ensuring that its themes would echo through centuries of Western thought. Long before the term entered medical language, the myth had already captured a timeless human pattern: self-absorption leading not to fulfillment, but to isolation and emotional death. There is another quiet detail in the myth that often goes unnoticed. After Narcissus dies, his body is transformed into a flower, the narcissus, or daffodil. Some scholars see this transformation as deeply symbolic. The flower is beautiful, but fragile and short-lived, blooming briefly before fading. In this way, it reflects the nature of narcissistic self-focus itself, outwardly striking, yet ultimately unsustainable when disconnected from real human bonds. Even the word narcissus carries an additional layer of meaning. Linguistically, it may be linked to the Greek word narke, meaning numbness or stupor. This connection subtly reinforces the idea that narcissism involves not only excessive self-focus, but also a kind of emotional anesthesia, a dulling of sensitivity to others and eventually to one's own inner life. By the late 19th century, thinkers like Havelock Ellis and later Sigmund Freud began using the term narcissism in a clinical sense. What had once been myth became diagnosis. Yet the transition from poetry to psychiatry did not erase the story's original insight. Instead, it confirmed it. Narcissism is not simply a personality quirk or an excess of confidence. It is a fundamental disruption in how a person relates to the world beyond themselves. Like Narcissus gazing into the water, the narcissistic individual does not truly meet others as they are. They interact with reflections, projections, and echoes. And in that quiet, shimmering pool, real connection slowly slips away. Chapter 2. From Baby to Ego. Freud's take on narcissism's start. As we move a little deeper into the psychology of narcissism, we arrive at a turning point in its modern understanding, shaped by the work of Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century. In 1914, Freud published a paper titled On Narcissism, an Introduction, and with it, he changed the way narcissism was viewed. Rather than treating it as a flaw or moral failing, Freud placed narcissism at the very beginning of human development. Freud suggested that narcissism starts not as a disorder, but as a natural phase of early life. He called this phase primary narcissism. In this earliest stage of infancy, the child's psychic energy, which Freud referred to as libido, is directed entirely inward. The infant experiences the world as if everything revolves around them. Hunger is satisfied, discomfort is soothed, and needs are met, often without delay. From the infant's perspective, there is no clear boundary yet between the self and the outside world. The baby feels powerful, complete, and central, not out of arrogance, but because differentiation has not yet begun. In healthy development, this inward focus slowly changes. As the child grows, their attention and emotional energy begin to move outward. Freud called this shift object love, meaning the ability to invest emotionally in other people. The child gradually learns that caregivers are separate beings with their own presence, intentions, and limits. This movement outward is essential. It allows relationships, empathy, and mutual recognition to form. Freud believed that problems arise when this developmental transition does not unfold smoothly. If a child experiences trauma, neglect, or emotional disruption, the outward movement of emotional energy may stall or even reverse. In such cases, Freud proposed that libido is withdrawn from others and redirected back toward the self. He called this process secondary narcissism. This inward retreat, according to Freud, creates the psychological conditions for pathological narcissism. The individual becomes excessively invested in their own ego. Self-importance, grandiosity, and fantasies of superiority begin to dominate, while the ability to form deep emotional bonds with others weakens. The ego becomes inflated, but paradoxically fragile, because it depends entirely on protecting itself from perceived threats. From this perspective, Freud viewed narcissism as a defensive strategy. Loving others involves risk. It exposes a person to disappointment, rejection, and loss. By pulling emotional energy back into the self, the narcissistic individual avoids vulnerability. But this protection comes at a cost. The very act of self-preservation also leads to emotional isolation. The narcissist feels safe from rejection, yet cut off from genuine connection. Freud's distinction between primary and secondary narcissism became a foundational idea in psychodynamic theory. It framed narcissism not as a fixed personality flaw, but as the result of disrupted development. In this view, the narcissist remains psychologically anchored to an early sense of omnipotence, unable to fully move beyond the infantile experience of being the center of the world. However, as psychoanalytic thought evolved, Freud's model did not go unchallenged. Later theorists, particularly those working in object relations theory, offered important revisions. Melanie Klein, for example, argued that infants are never as self-contained as Freud imagined. She rejected the idea of a purely inward phase of narcissism, suggesting instead that even very young infants relate to internalized images of caregivers from the beginning. In her view, emotional life is relational from the start, not something that emerges only after a solitary phase. This shift in thinking softened Freud's sharp division between primary and secondary narcissism. Modern attachment research further supports this relational perspective. Studies suggest that early bonding patterns play a crucial role in shaping later narcissistic traits. Children who experience dismissive or avoidant caregiving, where emotional needs are minimized, are more likely to develop overt, grandiose forms of narcissism. In contrast, children exposed to inconsistent or anxious caregiving may develop more vulnerable, hypersensitive forms of narcissism. These findings point to multiple developmental pathways rather than a single linear process. Narcissism, as it is understood today, is no longer seen simply as a regression of psychic energy back into the self. Instead, it is understood as a complex interaction between temperament, early relationships, emotional regulation, and self-esteem development. Even so, Freud's original insight remains deeply influential. His work established that narcissism is rooted in development, not morality. It highlighted the tension between the need for self-protection and the need for connection, a tension that continues to shape how psychologists understand narcissistic patterns today. As we slowly move through these ideas, we begin to see narcissism not as a mystery of arrogance, but as a story of how early emotional worlds leave lasting imprints on the self.
Chapter 3. Two Views of the Narcissistic Self, Kohut versus Kernberg. As we continue exploring narcissism, we arrive at a thoughtful and deeply influential conversation that shaped how clinicians understand this personality pattern today. In the middle of the 20th century, two psychoanalysts, Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg, offered very different yet strangely complementary explanations for how narcissistic personality disorder develops and how it might be treated. Their debate was not simply academic. At its heart was a gentle but serious question: is the narcissist primarily wounded or primarily defensive? The answer, as we will see, depends on where you choose to look. Heinz Kohut approached narcissism through what he called self-psychology. He believed that every child needs certain emotional experiences in order to develop a stable sense of self. Among the most important are mirroring, the experience of having one's strengths and uniqueness seen and affirmed, and idealization, the ability to look up to a calm, strong figure and feel protected by that connection. When these needs are met consistently, the child's sense of self grows cohesive and resilient. According to Kohut, problems arise when this empathic environment fails. If parents are emotionally unavailable, dismissive, or unable to respond warmly to the child's inner world, the child's normal narcissistic needs remain unmet. They do not disappear. Instead, they become frozen in time. The adult narcissist, in this view, is not someone who loves themselves too much, but someone who never fully learned how to feel whole. What looks like arrogance or superiority, Kohut argued, is actually a fragile shell. Beneath the grandiosity lies a fragmented self, marked by shame, emptiness, and a constant hunger for validation. Kohut believed that effective therapy must begin with empathy. By offering the understanding and mirroring the patient never received in childhood, the therapist can help restart the stalled developmental process and slowly strengthen the self from within. Otto Kernberg saw the same clinical behaviors but interpreted them very differently. Working from an object relations perspective, he viewed narcissism not as arrested development but as an active and rigid defense. In his model, early relationships are often experienced as cold, punitive, or frightening.
In response, the child develops intense aggression, envy, and fear of dependency. Rather than remaining emotionally underdeveloped, the narcissistic individual, in Kernberg's view, constructs a false self. This structure is designed to deny vulnerability and dependency at all costs. The narcissist splits the world into extremes. The self is experienced as entirely good, powerful, and superior, while others are seen as inferior, dangerous, or contemptible. Any unacceptable feelings, such as weakness or rage, are projected outward. For Kernberg, narcissism is not simply about unmet needs. It is about aggression that cannot be tolerated internally. This is why he emphasized confrontation in treatment. Therapy, in his view, must help patients recognize their defenses, integrate their split perceptions, and face their underlying hostility and envy. Without this, he believed, empathy alone risks reinforcing the grandiose structure rather than dismantling it. The contrast between these two perspectives is striking. Kohut emphasized shame and emptiness. Kernberg emphasized envy and aggression. Kohut saw grandiosity as a fragile covering for a wounded core, while Kernberg saw it as a fortified structure built to dominate and deny dependence. Kohut focused on empathic immersion, Kernberg on interpretation and confrontation. And yet, both were observing real phenomena. This is why their debate remains so important. In everyday clinical work, narcissism does not appear in a single form. Some individuals present as wounded, depressive, and desperately seeking affirmation. Others appear cold, exploitive, and openly contemptuous of others. Many show elements of both. Modern clinicians increasingly recognize that Kohut and Kernberg were not necessarily contradicting each other, but illuminating different sides of the same condition. Diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, particularly in manuals like the DSM, tend to emphasize overt grandiosity and entitlement, echoing Kernberg's descriptions. At the same time, these criteria often fail to capture the deep vulnerability, shame, and emptiness that Kohut described so carefully. As a result, many contemporary therapeutic approaches take an integrative stance. Therapists may begin with empathy to stabilize the patient's sense of self, while also gently confronting patterns of entitlement, aggression, and splitting as trust develops. Approaches such as transference-focused therapy and mentalization-based therapy reflect this balance, drawing from both traditions. In the end, the debate between Kohut and Kernberg teaches us something quietly profound. Narcissism is not a single story. It is a complex landscape where unmet needs, defensive structures, shame, and aggression all intertwine. Understanding this helps us see narcissistic individuals not as caricatures, but human beings shaped by early relational worlds, carrying defenses that once protected them and now keep them painfully alone.
Chapter 4. Steady Self-Worth versus the Shaky Kind. To understand narcissism clearly, it helps to slow down and separate two very different experiences of self-love. Not all narcissism is harmful. In fact, a certain degree of self-regard is not only healthy but necessary for emotional balance and growth. Healthy narcissism is the quiet, regulated sense of self-worth that allows a person to move through life with confidence and resilience. It is what gives someone the courage to set goals, take risks, and recover when things do not go as planned. When a person with healthy self-regard succeeds, they feel genuine pride. When they fail, they feel disappointment, but they do not collapse. Their sense of who they are remains intact. This form of self-love is flexible. It allows room for self-reflection, learning, and empathy. A person can acknowledge their strengths without exaggerating them, and recognize their limitations without feeling destroyed by them.
They can celebrate their achievements without needing to diminish others, and they can care about how others feel without losing their own sense of value. In this way, healthy narcissism becomes the emotional fuel for resilience rather than a barrier to connection. Pathological narcissism, by contrast, tells a very different story. In narcissistic personality disorder, self-esteem is not something that lives securely inside. It must be constantly supplied from the outside. Praise, admiration, attention, and status become essential for emotional survival. A useful way to imagine this difference is to think of self-esteem as a system of regulation. In healthy individuals, it functions like a thermostat. It adjusts smoothly in response to success or failure, warmth or challenge. In pathological narcissism, it functions more like a balloon. It looks large and impressive from the outside, but it requires constant inflation. Without continual validation, it quickly deflates. This dependence on external approval creates a painful paradox. The narcissistic individual may appear confident, superior, or even untouchable, yet underneath that image lies extreme fragility. A small criticism does not feel like a minor inconvenience. It feels like a direct threat to their psychological survival. As a result, even gentle feedback can trigger disproportionate rage, defensiveness, or emotional collapse. Research consistently shows that pathological narcissism is marked by unstable self-esteem and emotional dysregulation. People with this pattern often swing between extremes. At one moment, they may feel grandiose, entitled, and superior. At another, they may feel empty, ashamed, or worthless. These rapid shifts can be confusing and unsettling, both for the individual and for those around them. Survivors of relationships with narcissistic individuals often describe this contrast vividly, noting how someone can seem full of confidence one day and utterly diminished the next. Modern psychological models emphasize that grandiosity and vulnerability are not opposites in narcissism. They often coexist. What looks like arrogance may be a fragile defense against deep insecurity. What sounds like entitlement may conceal a fear of being insignificant or unseen. This instability is the defining feature that separates healthy confidence from personality-level pathology. In the end, the difference between healthy and pathological narcissism is not about how much someone values themselves. It is about how securely that value is held. Healthy self-esteem is steady and self-sustaining. Pathological narcissism is volatile and dependent. One supports growth, connection, and resilience. The other demands constant reinforcement and collapses without it.
Chapter 5. The Bold Type. Getting the Grandiose Narcissist. As we move along the spectrum of narcissism, we now meet the type that most people recognize immediately. The grandiose or overt narcissist closely matches the familiar cultural image of narcissism. This is the individual who walks into a room expecting attention, admiration, and deference, not as a hope, but as something they believe is owed to them. The overt narcissist is often highly visible. They are expressive, confident, and outwardly self-assured. Their belief in their own superiority feels unshakable, and they tend to speak and act as though their importance is self-evident. They do not merely enjoy being noticed, they expect it. Attention, in their mind, is a birthright rather than a privilege. This strong sense of entitlement shapes how they relate to others. People are not experienced as equals with independent inner lives, but as tools,
stepping stones, or reflections of the narcissist's success. Because of this, exploitation often occurs without guilt. If someone is useful, they are valued. If not, they are easily dismissed. From a clinical perspective, grandiose narcissists typically display high self-confidence and relatively low levels of anxiety or emotional self-doubt, at least on the surface. Their confidence can be captivating. Many are charming, articulate, and persuasive, qualities that allow them to rise quickly in competitive environments or leadership positions. Their certainty can easily be mistaken for competence, especially in settings that reward boldness and decisiveness. Yet, beneath this confident exterior, relationships remain largely transactional. The overt narcissist tends to sort people into simple categories. Those who enhance their image or status are seen as winners. Those who challenge them, disappoint them, or fail to admire them are quickly labeled as unimportant or inferior. Emotional sensitivity toward others is limited, while sensitivity toward their own image is extreme. When their sense of superiority is threatened, their reactions are often direct and unmistakable. Unlike more subtle forms of narcissism, the grandiose narcissist's aggression tends to be open. They may belittle, insult, issue demands, or openly devalue others. Any perceived slight, no matter how small, can provoke anger or contempt. In these moments, empathy disappears, replaced by the urgent need to restore dominance. Psychological research supports this picture. Measures of grandiose narcissism consistently show high levels of extroversion, boldness, and dominance. Tools such as the Narcissistic Personality Inventory capture this blend of leadership, persuasiveness, and entitlement, alongside a willingness to exploit others. These individuals often speak freely about their achievements, emphasize their uniqueness, and expect recognition as confirmation of their worth. However, despite their apparent confidence, their self-esteem remains dependent on external validation. Praise and admiration act as fuel. Without them, the confidence that once seemed solid can quickly fracture. This fragility explains why criticism is experienced not as useful feedback, but as a personal attack. The emotional response may appear disproportionate because it is defending a vulnerable core. In organizational settings, the grandiose narcissist can be both energizing and destructive. Studies show that such leaders may initially inspire teams through vision and charisma, increasing motivation and engagement. Over time, their intolerance of criticism and need for control often generate resentment, fear, and even unethical behavior among those who work under them. Ultimately, the overt narcissist embodies a familiar paradox. They present themselves as heroic, exceptional, and unstoppable, yet their sense of self depends heavily on remaining at the center of attention. When admiration flows, they shine. When it falters, they may lash out, blame others, or portray themselves as unfairly persecuted. Behind the crown they wear so confidently lies a self that cannot tolerate being ordinary, questioned, or unseen. Chapter 6. The Hidden Hurt. Inside the Vulnerable Narcissist. Not all narcissism announces itself loudly. Some forms hide in plain sight, wrapped in shyness, sensitivity, and apparent humility. This is where we meet the vulnerable or covert narcissist, a type that often feels more confusing and difficult to recognize than the openly grandiose kind. On the surface, a vulnerable narcissist may seem modest, anxious, or even self-effacing. They often present themselves as misunderstood or overlooked, someone who has never quite been given the recognition they deserve. Yet beneath this quieter exterior lies the same core feature found in all narcissistic patterns, a deeply held belief in their own specialness and entitlement. The difference is not in what they believe about themselves, but how they express it. Rather than demanding admiration openly, the vulnerable narcissist carries a persistent sense of grievance. They believe they possess unique insight, talent, or moral depth, but feel the world has failed to notice it. Over time, this perceived injustice turns into chronic resentment. Bitterness settles in, accompanied by the feeling of being a perpetual victim of unfair treatment. Because they lack the social boldness to claim attention directly, vulnerable narcissists rely on more indirect strategies. Guilt becomes a powerful tool. Passive-aggressive remarks, sighs of disappointment, and subtle emotional pressure replace overt demands. The familiar "poor me" narrative emerges not as a passing complaint, but as a way of securing reassurance and validation. Criticism, even when mild or intended, is especially painful for this type. Neutral comments are often experienced as deeply personal attacks. A simple suggestion or difference of opinion can trigger intense emotional reactions, including withdrawal, silent resentment, or sudden emotional collapse. Research consistently links vulnerable narcissism with high levels of anxiety and neuroticism, reflecting this heightened sensitivity to perceived rejection. In close relationships, the vulnerable narcissist can become emotionally draining. They often require constant reassurance, sympathy, and emotional caretaking, while offering little in return. Partners may find themselves endlessly comforting, explaining, or apologizing, unsure how conflict began or why it feels so exhausting. Over time, this imbalance creates emotional depletion, even though no obvious cruelty seems to be taking place.
The harm caused by the covert narcissist is often subtle rather than dramatic. Instead of open insults or commands, the abuse takes quieter forms. There may be prolonged silence used as punishment, compliments that carry hidden barbs, or emotional withdrawal that leaves others feeling anxious and responsible. Because these behaviors are understated, they are easy to excuse or misunderstand. This subtlety is what makes vulnerable narcissism particularly dangerous in relationships. The individual may appear kind, thoughtful, or wounded, leading others to dismiss their own discomfort. Victims often sense that something feels wrong long before they can clearly name it. By the time the pattern becomes visible, emotional entanglement is already deep. Psychological research confirms that vulnerable narcissism is associated with introversion, emotional instability, and heightened defensiveness. Unlike their grandiose counterparts, vulnerable narcissists do not boast, they brood. They anticipate criticism and brace for rejection, often responding with self-pity or quiet rage when their fragile self-image is threatened. At their core, vulnerable narcissists swing between two painful states. At times, they feel deeply inadequate, ashamed, and unworthy. At other moments, flashes of entitlement surface, revealing the belief that they deserve special treatment or understanding. These swings can be disorienting, both for the individual and for those close to them. Understanding this form of narcissism requires patience and clarity. The vulnerable narcissist is not simply shy or insecure. Their sensitivity is organized around protecting a fragile sense of superiority. What appears to be modesty often masks a hidden demand to be seen as exceptional, and what looks like emotional fragility can quietly pull others into a cycle of guilt, caretaking, and self-doubt.
By recognizing these patterns, we begin to see that narcissism does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, carrying its need for validation through silence, sorrow, and the quiet insistence of being misunderstood.
Chapter 7. When it gets dangerous. The Malignant Narcissist. As we continue along the spectrum of narcissism, we now arrive at its most severe and dangerous expression. Malignant narcissism sits at a crossroads where several dark psychological patterns converge. It combines features of narcissistic personality disorder with elements of antisocial behavior, paranoia, and sadism. This is not merely an exaggerated form of self-love. It is a pattern marked by cruelty, domination, and a striking absence of remorse. Unlike other narcissistic types, who may harm others as a side effect of their need for admiration, the malignant narcissist goes further. They derive satisfaction from the suffering they cause. Inflicting pain is not accidental or regrettable. It is often deliberate and emotionally rewarding. This is what makes malignant narcissism particularly dangerous. Individuals with this pattern tend to be intensely aggressive and vindictive. They view the world as a zero-sum battlefield where one must either dominate or be dominated. Cooperation is seen as weakness, and empathy is interpreted as a vulnerability to be exploited. This mindset leaves little room for trust or mutual respect. Paranoia is a central feature. Malignant narcissists are constantly scanning their environment for threats, real or imagined. Neutral actions are easily misinterpreted as attacks, slights, or conspiracies. This distorted perception allows them to justify preemptive aggression. In their mind, striking first is not cruelty, it is self-defense. The term malignant narcissism was introduced by the social psychologist and psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, who described it as the quintessence of evil. By this, he did not mean that such individuals are mythical villains, but that they represent a psychological pattern in which grandiosity, destructiveness, and moral emptiness converge. Fromm observed that when narcissism fuses with aggression and a lack of conscience, the result is a personality organized around domination rather than connection. In everyday settings, malignant narcissists are not content with simply winning an argument or gaining advantage. They seek to annihilate opposition. In workplaces, they may engage in relentless smear campaigns, sabotage colleagues, or stalk perceived rivals. In intimate relationships, they may terrorize partners through intimidation, control, and threats. Physical aggression is not uncommon, and emotional cruelty is often calculated and sustained. Psychoanalytic descriptions of malignant narcissism emphasize conscious sadism. These individuals are not unaware of the harm they cause. They know it, and they enjoy it. Accounts describe them as pathologically grandiose, devoid of conscience, and capable of what has been called joyful cruelty. Suffering in others becomes proof of power. Although malignant narcissism is not an official diagnosis in modern psychiatric manuals, clinicians widely recognize the pattern. It is often understood as narcissistic personality disorder combined with antisocial traits. Otto Kernberg, one of the leading theorists in this field, even described psychopathy itself as a malignant form of narcissism, highlighting the overlap between extreme narcissism, sadism, and antisocial behavior. This overlap helps explain why malignant narcissists pose such a serious risk. Their capacity for empathy is nearly absent. Their aggression is not moderated by guilt or concern for consequences. When challenged, they escalate rather than retreat. When abandoned, they may pursue revenge rather than disengagement.
For those who encounter a malignant narcissist, the danger is not merely emotional, it can be physical, legal, and long-lasting. Attempts to set boundaries or leave the relationship may provoke intensified retaliation rather than acceptance. This is why awareness and caution are so important when dealing with individuals who exhibit this pattern. Understanding malignant narcissism does not mean excusing it. Rather, it allows us to recognize when narcissism has crossed from insecurity into destruction. At this extreme end of the spectrum, the drive is no longer to be admired, but to dominate and eradicate perceived threats. In these cases, safety, distance, and professional support become not just advisable, but essential.
Chapter 8. Kindness as a Show. The Communal Narcissist. As we continue exploring the many faces of narcissism, we now encounter a form that often hides behind generosity, morality, and public virtue. The communal narcissist does not seek admiration by boasting about power, intelligence, or beauty. Instead, they build their sense of superiority through kindness, sacrifice, and service, or at least the appearance of it. On the surface, the communal narcissist often looks admirable. They may be deeply involved in charitable work, religious communities, social movements, or advocacy groups. They are frequently described as selfless, compassionate, and endlessly giving. Helping others becomes their chosen path to recognition. Praise does not come from being successful or dominant, but from being seen as the most caring, the most ethical, or the most devoted person in the room. This outward altruism, however, serves the same psychological purpose as grandiosity in other forms of narcissism. The communal narcissist seeks validation through moral superiority. Being perceived as a savior, a moral guide, or a tireless helper provides the admiration they crave. Their sense of worth is tightly bound to how visibly good they appear to others. Psychological research describes communal narcissism as an inflated self-view within the social and moral domain. These individuals sincerely believe they are unusually warm, generous, or ethically advanced. They may speak often about their volunteer work, their values, or their commitment to justice and compassion. Yet these declarations are less about the cause itself and more about reinforcing a special self-image. A striking feature of communal narcissism is the gap between public persona and private behavior. In public, the communal narcissist may seem endlessly patient and giving. In private, especially toward family members or close partners, they may be cold, neglectful, controlling, or emotionally abusive. The energy spent maintaining a saintly image for the outside world often leaves little care for those closest to them. This contrast can be deeply confusing and painful for those living with a communal narcissist. Children or spouses may experience criticism, emotional withdrawal, or manipulation at home, while watching the same person receive admiration and praise from the wider community. When outsiders see only generosity and virtue, the victim's reality is often dismissed or doubted. This creates a powerful form of gaslighting, where the harmed individual begins to question their own perceptions. Recognition is essential for the communal narcissist. Their generosity is rarely unconditional. When their efforts are praised, highlighted, or rewarded, they feel energized and affirmed. When recognition fades, resentment often follows. If their sacrifices are not acknowledged loudly enough, they may grow angry, bitter, or suddenly disengage from the cause altogether. What appeared to be devotion quickly reveals itself as conditional involvement. Research shows that communal narcissists are particularly sensitive to criticism of their moral image. Even gentle feedback can feel like an attack on their identity as a good and selfless person.
When challenged, they may react defensively, accuse others of ingratitude, or portray themselves as misunderstood martyrs. Their kindness becomes a shield against accountability. In group settings, communal narcissists often attract followers. Their confidence in their own goodness can be compelling, especially in moral or spiritual contexts. Yet beneath this leadership lies a quiet demand for admiration. They want to be seen as the most ethical voice, the most caring leader, the moral center around which others revolve. Ultimately, communal narcissism is not a contradiction of narcissism, but a variation of it. The underlying goal remains the same: self-enhancement and validation. What differs is the route taken to get there. Instead of seeking admiration through dominance or achievement, the communal narcissist seeks it through moral heroism. Understanding this pattern helps us see that narcissism does not always look selfish on the surface. Sometimes it wears the language of kindness, sacrifice, and virtue. And while genuine altruism is grounded in empathy and concern for others, communal narcissism quietly redirects generosity back toward the self, turning goodness into a mirror rather than a bridge to real connection.
Chapter 9. Body Pride or Brain Pride? Narcissism's Two Sides. As we continue exploring the many expressions of narcissism, it becomes clear that not all narcissists draw their sense of superiority from the same place. One useful way of understanding this difference is to look at where their self-esteem is anchored. For some, it lives in the body. For others, it lives in the mind. This distinction, highlighted by researchers such as Sam Vaknin, helps explain why narcissism can appear so differently from one person to another. The somatic narcissist builds their sense of worth around the physical self. Appearance, youth, fitness, sexual desirability, and vitality become central pillars of identity. The body is not simply something they inhabit, it becomes a carefully curated symbol of superiority. Time, money, and energy are often poured into maintaining this image, whether through intense exercise routines, cosmetic enhancements, extreme diets, or relentless attention to style and presentation. For the somatic narcissist, admiration is closely tied to being seen. Compliments about attractiveness or desirability are not just pleasant, they are emotionally essential. Romantic partners are often treated less as equals and more as accessories, expected to enhance the narcissist's visual or social status. Intimacy may appear frequent, but it is often shallow. Sex becomes a tool for validation rather than a space for emotional connection. This focus on the body can also produce anxiety. Many somatic narcissists become preoccupied with health concerns, aging, or perceived physical flaws. Some develop hypochondriacal tendencies or swing between extreme wellness practices and neglect. Underneath the obsession with vitality lies a fear of decline, invisibility, and loss of admiration. The cerebral narcissist, by contrast, finds their sense of superiority in the realm of the mind. Intelligence, knowledge, creativity, or expertise become the foundation of their identity. They may see themselves as intellectual elites, visionaries, or misunderstood geniuses. Conversation becomes a stage where they can demonstrate superiority through vocabulary, argument, or insight. Cerebral narcissists often show little interest in physical appearance, sometimes dismissing it as trivial or beneath them. Their dominance is exercised through ideas rather than aesthetics. They may belittle others as ignorant, uninformed, or intellectually inferior, using debate, correction, or subtle humiliation to reinforce their position. Withholding information can become a form of power, reinforcing the sense that they alone possess valuable knowledge. Importantly, these two forms are not fixed identities. Narcissists can move between them depending on circumstance. This flexibility is sometimes described as a shifting or compensatory dynamic.
A narcissist whose intellectual identity is damaged by career failure or criticism may suddenly redirect their energy towards physical transformation, immersing themselves in fitness, appearance, or sexual conquest to restore a sense of superiority. Likewise, a somatic narcissist facing aging or physical decline may retreat into intellectual posturing or moral superiority. This ability to switch strategies highlights an important truth. The core issue is not the body or the mind themselves, but the need for external validation. Whether admiration comes from being seen as beautiful or being seen as brilliant, the function is the same. It shores up a fragile sense of self that cannot sustain itself internally. Clinically, distinguishing between somatic and cerebral narcissism can be helpful. It allows therapists to understand where a person's grandiosity is centered and how it is defended. A narcissist obsessed with health, youth, or sexual status may require very different interventions from one whose identity rests on intellectual dominance or expertise. In the quiet space between these two paths, we begin to see that narcissism is remarkably adaptable. When one source of pride falters, another is often recruited. The mirror may shift from the body to the mind or back again, but the underlying need remains unchanged: to feel superior, admired, and protected from the vulnerability of being ordinary.
Chapter 10. The Hidden Craving. What Narcissistic Supply Means. To understand how narcissism sustains itself over time, it helps to look closely at a concept that sits at the very center of the disorder. Psychoanalysis refers to this concept as narcissistic supply. In simple terms, it is the emotional fuel the narcissist depends on to keep their sense of self intact. Without it, their inner world begins to unravel. Narcissistic supply is not a luxury for the narcissist. It is experienced as a necessity. Attention, admiration, and emotional reactions from others function like oxygen. They confirm the narcissist's existence and reinforce the image they hold of themselves. When that flow of validation slows or stops, the result is not mild disappointment, but profound psychological distress. Clinicians often compare narcissistic supply to an addiction. Just as a substance temporarily stabilizes an addict, supply temporarily stabilizes the narcissist's fragile ego. It shields them from underlying shame and self-doubt, allowing them to maintain a sense of power and significance. Without this external reinforcement, the narcissist may experience what has been described as psychic collapse or fragmentation, a feeling that the self is falling apart. Narcissistic supply takes different forms, but all serve the same purpose. The most direct form is what is often called primary supply. This includes admiration, praise, fame, status, or any form of attention that places the narcissist at the center. Applause, compliments, recognition, and visibility all function as direct confirmation of their importance. Interestingly, attention does not need to be positive to serve this role. Fear, outrage, and even hatred can function as supply when admiration is unavailable. Being the object of strong emotional reactions, even negative ones, reassures the narcissist that they are powerful and impactful. Indifference, by contrast, is far more threatening because it suggests irrelevance. There is also a quieter, more stable form of supply known as secondary supply. This does not always come in the form of praise or attention, but rather in the structures that make supply possible. A spouse, a loyal partner, a respected job title, a social position, or even a well-maintained home can all function as secondary supply. These provide a reliable backdrop, allowing the narcissist to pursue admiration while feeling anchored and supported. People in the narcissist's life are often unconsciously assigned roles based on how well they provide these forms of supply.
Rather than being experienced as whole individuals with their own needs and feelings, they become sources. Their value is measured by how effectively they reflect admiration, react emotionally, or maintain the narcissist's image. This transactional way of relating explains a pattern that can feel especially painful to those close to narcissists. When a person stops reacting, stops praising, or begins asserting boundaries, they are often devalued or discarded. From the narcissist's perspective, the source has been depleted. Moving on does not feel cruel to them. It feels practical, like replacing a drained battery. When narcissistic supply is threatened or cut off, panic often follows. This state is clinically known as narcissistic injury, and is frequently accompanied by rage, withdrawal, or frantic attempts to regain attention. Much of the narcissist's behavior, from idealizing new relationships to provoking conflict, can be understood as an effort to keep this supply flowing. Over time, this constant hunger takes a toll. Relationships become hollow, focused more on what can be extracted than what can be shared. Emotional reciprocity fades, replaced by performance and control. While narcissistic supply may keep the ego afloat in the short term, it ultimately prevents the deep, mutual connections that offer real emotional nourishment. Understanding narcissistic supply allows us to see narcissism not simply as arrogance, but as dependency. Beneath the grand exterior lies a self that cannot sustain itself alone, endlessly seeking confirmation from the outside world and never quite finding the rest it is looking for.
Chapter 11. When Love Fades Away. Object Constancy Explained. One of the most important and often most painful features of narcissism lies in a quiet cognitive gap known as object constancy. This concept helps explain why relationships with narcissistic individuals can feel so unstable, unpredictable, and emotionally disorienting. In healthy emotional development, a child gradually learns that important people remain the same even when they are not physically present or emotionally available. A parent can be absent, frustrated, or disappointed and still be experienced as loving and reliable. This ability allows adults to stay emotionally connected to a partner during conflict, distance, or temporary disappointment. Love does not vanish simply because feelings fluctuate. This capacity is called object constancy, and it builds on an earlier developmental milestone known as object permanence. While object permanence allows a child to understand that something still exists when it cannot be seen, object constancy allows an individual to hold on to a stable emotional image of another person, even when circumstances change. In narcissism, this capacity is often underdeveloped or fragile. For the narcissistic individual, emotional connection tends to exist only in the present moment. When a partner is physically absent, emotionally unavailable, or no longer affirming, the internal sense of that person quickly fades. It is not simply that the narcissist feels hurt or disappointed, it is as though the emotional bond itself disappears. This is why phrases like out of sight, out of mind feel painfully accurate in narcissistic relationships. Even more striking is the experience of being out of favor. When a narcissist becomes angry or feels deprived of attention, the emotional memory of love is no longer accessible. The partner who was once idealized can suddenly feel like a stranger or even an enemy. This sudden shift explains the intensity and speed of narcissistic rage. The reaction is not moderated by remembered affection or emotional continuity. Without access to prior feelings of love, there is nothing to soften the anger. Detachment becomes immediate and complete, as if the relationship never truly existed.
Because of this deficit, narcissists do not miss people in the same way emotionally healthy individuals do. What they tend to miss is not the person themselves, but the role that person played. When a relationship ends, the loss is experienced less as grief and more as the loss of a function, such as admiration, reassurance, or emotional regulation. Psychodynamic theorists have long linked problems with object constancy to early attachment experiences. When caregivers are inconsistent, unpredictable, or emotionally unavailable, a child may never develop a stable internal representation of them. Without that internal anchor, relationships in adulthood remain fragile, dependent on immediate feedback rather than enduring connection. Clinically, this lack of object constancy manifests in extreme shifts in perception. A partner can be idealized one moment and devalued the next, not because the partner has changed, but because the narcissist's emotional state has. Under stress, positive memories vanish, replaced by a rigid negative image. This process, often called splitting, leaves little room for nuance or complexity. Psychological observations consistently note this pattern in narcissistic personality disorder. Without object constancy, a person can appear loving one minute and hateful the next, responding as though the other person has suddenly become someone else entirely. This emotional instability makes genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Intimacy requires the ability to remain connected through disagreement, frustration, and imperfection. For those who have been in relationships with narcissistic individuals, understanding object constancy can be deeply clarifying. It explains why reassurance never seems to last, why apologies are forgotten, and why affection can evaporate without warning. It also highlights why healing involves rebuilding one's own internal sense of stability, learning to hold on to personal truth even when another person's perception shifts. In therapeutic work, strengthening object constancy is often a key goal. For survivors, this means learning to maintain a stable sense of self and others, even when relationships become strained or unpredictable. It is the quiet work of restoring emotional continuity, where love, memory, and reality can coexist even in moments of conflict or distance.
Chapter 12. Seeing in Extremes: How Splitting Works in Narcissism. One of the most defining psychological patterns in narcissism is something known as splitting. This process is closely linked to the absence of object constancy, and together they shape the unstable emotional world that surrounds narcissistic relationships. Splitting is a way the mind protects itself from emotional discomfort. When someone cannot tolerate mixed feelings, uncertainty, or contradiction, the psyche looks for a simpler solution. In narcissism, that solution is an extreme, binary way of seeing the world. People, situations, and even memories are divided into absolute categories. They are either entirely good or entirely bad, with no space in between. In this inner world, a partner is never simply a complex, imperfect human being. They are either idealized as a soulmate, savior, or flawless extension of the self, or they are condemned as a traitor, enemy, or source of betrayal. Nuance disappears. Ambivalence feels intolerable. When a narcissist encounters someone new, splitting often begins with idealization. The narcissist projects their most perfect fantasies onto this person, seeing only what they want to see. The new partner is elevated, admired, and placed on a pedestal. Attention flows easily during this phase, and the relationship can feel intoxicating, intense, and full of promise. But perfection cannot last. The moment the other person shows a limitation, expresses a boundary, or fails to meet an unspoken expectation, the internal balance collapses.
The narcissist cannot hold both positive and negative qualities at once. Instead, the mind flips to the opposite extreme. Idealization gives way to devaluation. In this phase, the very qualities once admired are rewritten as flaws. The partner who was once cherished is now seen as worthless, malicious, or deeply disappointing. What is especially painful is the speed of this transformation. A minor mistake, a forgotten message, or a moment of independence can trigger a complete emotional reversal. This process is not just internal, it is projected outward. The narcissist disowns their own unwanted feelings, such as shame, weakness, or inadequacy, and assigns them to the other person. The other person becomes the container for everything the narcissist cannot tolerate within themselves. In this way, splitting serves as both a defense and a form of emotional aggression. For those on the receiving end, life inside this dynamic feels deeply destabilizing. The emotional ground shifts constantly. Affection and admiration can turn into contempt without warning. Partners describe the experience as walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of themselves will be reflected back. Love becomes conditional, dependent on staying within the fragile boundaries of the all-good category. The pressure to remain idealized is exhausting. There is no room for ordinary human error. One misstep can result in sudden coldness, rage, or withdrawal. This unpredictability erodes trust and leaves victims questioning their own reality, wondering how everything changed so quickly. Psychologically, splitting disables empathy. When someone is placed in the all-bad category, their feelings, intentions, and humanity no longer register. The narcissist's perception becomes rigid and defensive, focused solely on preserving their self-image. Any challenge to that image is experienced as an attack, and the response is immediate polarization. Clinicians observe this pattern across narcissistic presentations, noting how easily admiration transforms into contempt when a narcissist perceives rejection or loss of supply. The ideal self is projected onto one object, while the rejected, despised parts of the self are projected onto another. This constant oscillation between extremes creates the classic idealize and devalue cycle. Understanding splitting can be a powerful step toward clarity and healing. It helps explain why relationships with narcissists feel so intense, confusing, and emotionally unsafe. It also reminds survivors that the sudden shifts they experience are not caused by their failures, but a cognitive distortion that cannot tolerate complexity. In healthier emotional development, people learn to hold mixed feelings, to love someone while being frustrated with them, and to remain connected through imperfection. Splitting blocks this growth. Recognizing it allows survivors to step out of the black and white frame and return to a more compassionate, grounded view of themselves and others, where nuance, stability, and emotional continuity are once again possible.
Chapter 13. When the facade breaks. Injury and rage in narcissism. As we continue exploring the inner mechanics of narcissism, we now come to a moment where the fragile structure of the narcissistic self is most clearly revealed. This moment is known as narcissistic injury, and it is often followed by a powerful and unsettling reaction called narcissistic rage. A narcissistic injury occurs whenever the narcissist perceives a threat to their self-image. This threat does not need to be dramatic. It can be something that most people would barely notice or quickly forget. A disagreement, a forgotten detail, a lack of admiration, or a mild critique can be enough. What matters is not the event itself, but what it symbolizes to the narcissist. Unlike healthy self-esteem, which is flexible and resilient, the narcissist's ego is rigid and hollow. It is built around a carefully maintained image rather than an internally stable sense of worth.
Because of this, it cannot absorb criticism or frustration. When that image is challenged, the narcissist does not feel mildly disappointed or annoyed. They experience something closer to humiliation, exposure, or psychological annihilation. Psychologists often describe this reaction as a shame-rage cycle. The initial response to injury is intense shame. This shame is overwhelming and intolerable as it threatens to collapse the false self the narcissist depends on. Almost immediately, the shame is converted into rage. Narcissistic rage is fundamentally different from ordinary anger. Healthy anger arises in response to a specific issue and seeks understanding, repair, or resolution. Narcissistic rage, by contrast, is not about the original problem at all. It is about restoring the narcissist's sense of power and superiority after it has been shattered. The rage can take different forms. Sometimes it is explosive and obvious, erupting in shouting, insults, threats, or even physical aggression. This is often referred to as hot rage. In other cases, the response is cold and calculated. The narcissist may withdraw emotionally, impose prolonged silence, withhold affection, or engage in subtle punishment. This cold rage can be just as damaging, if not more so, because it leaves the target confused and desperate for resolution that never comes. Regardless of the form it takes, the goal of narcissistic rage is the same. It is designed to dominate, intimidate, or emotionally destroy the source of the injury. By subjugating the other person, the narcissist attempts to reclaim a sense of omnipotence and control. The rage is not random, it is targeted, purposeful, and deeply defensive. Clinicians often note that narcissistic rage feels disproportionate because it is not responding to the present moment alone. It is reacting to the collapse of the narcissist's internal structure. A minor disagreement can be experienced as a catastrophic exposure of inadequacy. The intensity of the reaction reflects the depth of the underlying shame. Different narcissistic subtypes express this rage differently. Grandiose narcissists tend to externalize it openly, lashing out in visible and dramatic ways. Vulnerable narcissists may turn inward, brooding, sulking, or seething silently while harboring deep resentment. In both cases, the emotional damage to those around them can be profound. For those who have experienced narcissistic rage, understanding its source can be deeply clarifying. These outbursts are not caused by personal failure, disrespect, or wrongdoing. They are driven by an internal crisis within the narcissist, triggered by perceived threats to their fragile self-image. In therapeutic contexts, recognizing narcissistic injury and rage helps survivors step out of self-blame. It allows them to see these reactions not as reflections of their worth, but defensive responses rooted in unresolved shame. By naming this pattern, the chaos begins to make sense, and the emotional weight of those encounters can slowly start to lift.
Chapter 14. Love That's Too Good. Idealization and Love Bombing. Relationships with narcissistic individuals often begin in a way that feels almost magical. This opening stage is known as idealization, and it is commonly expressed through what clinicians call love bombing. At first, it looks like deep romance, devotion, and emotional safety. In reality, it is the first phase of a predictable cycle of abuse. During love bombing, the narcissist floods the other person with attention. Compliments are constant, affection is intense, and communication feels endless. Messages arrive throughout the day. Praise is lavish and personal. The victim is made to feel uniquely seen, deeply valued, and emotionally chosen. For many, it feels like meeting the perfect partner at exactly the right moment. A defining feature of this phase is mirroring.
The narcissist carefully reflects the victim's values, interests, dreams, and even wounds back to them. If the victim cares deeply about kindness, the narcissist appears exceptionally compassionate. If the victim longs for commitment, the narcissist speaks passionately about forever. Shared interests seem uncanny, as though two lives were destined to align. Language during this phase often carries a sense of inevitability. Phrases like, "I've never felt this way before," or "we are meant to be together," appear early and frequently. The relationship accelerates at an unnatural pace. Emotional intimacy deepens rapidly. Future plans are discussed prematurely, and boundaries quietly dissolve under the weight of constant affection. Psychologically, this phase serves two critical purposes. First, it secures the victim as a reliable source of narcissistic supply. The admiration, attention, and emotional investment flowing from the victim feed the narcissist's fragile sense of self. Second, it conditions the victim's nervous system. The intensity of attention creates a powerful emotional high, driven by surges of dopamine and excitement. The narcissist becomes associated with pleasure, safety, and validation. Survivors often describe this stage as intoxicating. Interviews and clinical accounts consistently reveal similar experiences. Many recall being placed on a pedestal, described as perfect, and treated like a once-in-a-lifetime partner. Some describe the narcissist as a rescuer or a heroic figure who seemed to understand them better than anyone ever had. Yet, beneath the warmth of this attention lies something unsettling. The love is not directed towards the victim as a separate, complex individual. Instead, the narcissist is responding to the reflection they see in the victim's adoring gaze. In essence, they're falling in love with themselves as mirrored back to them. The victim is not being known, they are being idealized. This distinction is crucial. Love bombing is not an expression of deep attachment, it is a form of grooming. Much like techniques used in cult indoctrination, the narcissist establishes intense emotional closeness quickly, creating dependence before trust has had time to develop naturally. The victim becomes emotionally invested before they can evaluate the relationship clearly. This stage can last weeks or even months. During this time, the narcissist feels energized and secure, believing they have successfully captured admiration and control. But idealization is inherently unstable. No one can remain perfect forever, and the narcissist's need for dominance eventually reasserts itself. When the shift comes, it is often shocking. The contrast between the early intensity and the later withdrawal or cruelty makes the devaluation phase especially painful. Victims frequently blame themselves, wondering what they did wrong to lose the love they were given so freely at the beginning. Understanding idealization and love bombing as deliberate psychological manipulation rather than genuine intimacy can be a powerful step towards healing. It helps survivors see that the early perfection was not something they ruined, but something that was never sustainable. By recognizing this pattern, the confusion begins to clear, and the cycle of abuse becomes easier to name, understand, and eventually step away from.
Chapter 15. When the High Falls. The Devaluation Stage. After the intensity and emotional intoxication of idealization, many victims are left stunned when the atmosphere suddenly changes. This shift marks the beginning of the devaluation phase, the second stage in the narcissistic cycle of abuse. What once felt like unconditional love begins to erode, often without warning or explanation. Devaluation starts the moment reality intrudes on the narcissist's fantasy. The victim may express a need, assert a boundary, disagree with an opinion, or simply reveal their humanity. Any sign of independence or imperfection can feel deeply threatening to the narcissist.
Rather than adjusting their expectations, they experience this as a narcissistic injury, a reminder that the other person is not an extension of themselves. In response, punishment begins. The affection that once flowed freely is abruptly withdrawn. Compliments fade, warmth cools. In its place, criticism quietly takes root. At first, it may appear subtle, a sarcastic remark, a dismissive joke, a look of irritation where there was once admiration. But these moments accumulate, slowly reshaping the emotional landscape of the relationship. Soon, comparison enters the picture. The narcissist begins measuring the victim against others, often unfavorably. Former partners, friends, or even strangers are held up as examples of what the victim supposedly lacks. The message is clear, but rarely spoken outright. You are no longer enough. Manipulation becomes more overt during this phase. Gaslighting is used to distort reality, making the victim question their memory, intentions, or sanity. Stonewalling may appear, with the narcissist withdrawing communication or affection as a form of control. Blame is consistently shifted, ensuring that any conflict is framed as the victim's fault. Survivors often describe this phase as deeply confusing. The person who once praised them relentlessly now seems cold, critical, or contemptuous. Minor issues are inflated into character flaws. Behaviors once celebrated are now mocked or condemned. One moment the victim is ignored, the next they are lectured over trivial matters. The emotional reversal is shocking. This confusion plays a crucial psychological role. The victim, still holding on to the memory of the idealization phase, begins to believe that if they try harder, love can be restored. They double their efforts to please, to explain, to fix whatever they believe they have broken. In doing so, a trauma bond forms. A trauma bond is created when moments of emotional pain are intermittently paired with brief relief or approval. The victim begins seeking comfort from the very person causing the distress. The highs and lows become intertwined, making it increasingly difficult to leave. What feels like devotion is in reality a nervous system trapped in a cycle of hope and fear. From the narcissist's perspective, devaluation is not a sign that the relationship is failing. It is evidence that it is functioning exactly as intended. By destabilizing the victim's self-esteem, the narcissist regains dominance and control. Negative emotional reactions, confusion, and distress become new forms of narcissistic supply. Over time, devaluation can escalate into overt abuse. Name-calling, humiliation, and threats may replace subtle criticism. The victim is left emotionally exhausted, questioning their worth, and struggling to reconcile the loving person they once knew with the one now standing before them. Therapists emphasize that recognizing this phase is essential to breaking the cycle. Devaluation is not caused by the victim's shortcomings. It is a predictable stage in a manipulative pattern designed to maintain power. Understanding this truth can help survivors separate their identity from the abuse and begin the slow work of reclaiming clarity, self-worth, and emotional safety.
Chapter 16. Why Goodbye Isn't the End. Discard and Hoovering. As the narcissistic cycle of abuse reaches its later stages, many victims expect some form of resolution or closure. Instead, they often encounter one of the most disorienting phases of all, the discard. This stage marks the point at which the narcissist abruptly withdraws from the relationship, often with stunning coldness and little explanation. The discard typically happens when the victim is emotionally depleted or no longer able to provide the admiration, reassurance, or reaction the narcissist depends on. Sometimes it occurs because the narcissist has already secured a new source of supply.
In either case, the ending is rarely gentle. Long-term relationships, even marriages, may be terminated suddenly, sometimes through a brief message or complete silence. What makes the discard especially painful is the absence of empathy. The narcissist often rewrites the history of the relationship, framing the victim as the problem and themselves as justified. Shared memories are dismissed or distorted. Responsibility is shifted entirely onto the other person, leaving the victim confused, grieving, and searching for meaning in an ending that feels both abrupt and unreal. Survivors frequently describe this moment as emotionally shattering. After months or years of instability, criticism, and emotional effort, the relationship ends as though a switch has been flipped. The sudden withdrawal can feel like emotional abandonment, intensifying feelings of worthlessness and disbelief. Yet, for many, the story does not end there. The cycle often continues through a process known as hoovering, named after the vacuum cleaner. Hoovering refers to the narcissist's attempts to pull the victim back into contact after the discard. These attempts can take many forms. Sometimes they appear as messages of remorse, with apologies and declarations of regret. Other times they involve manufactured crises, such as illness, loneliness, or sudden vulnerability, designed to evoke sympathy. Sentimental memories may be invoked, reminding the victim of earlier, happier times. It is important to understand that hoovering is not a genuine attempt at reconciliation or repair. Its purpose is to test access. The narcissist wants to know whether they still have emotional influence and control. A single response, even one meant to provide closure, can signal that the door remains open. When the victim re-engages, the cycle typically resumes. The initial warmth may briefly resemble the idealization phase, but it is often shorter and less intense. Soon, the relationship slips quickly back into devaluation, sometimes without any period of affection at all. The Hoover has served its purpose by re-establishing dominance. Survivors often report that hoovering feels confusing because it mirrors the early days of the relationship just enough to reignite hope. Promises of change are made, affection briefly returns, but the underlying dynamic remains unchanged. Once control is regained, the familiar patterns reappear. Psychologically, discard and hoovering work together to keep the victim emotionally tethered. The unpredictability of abandonment, followed by renewed attention, strengthens the trauma bond. The victim remains caught between longing for connection and fear of further harm. Breaking free from this stage requires firm boundaries and, in many cases, complete no contact. Without these protections, narcissists are skilled at re-entering their victim's emotional world, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Understanding discard and hoovering can bring clarity to an experience that otherwise feels deeply personal and confusing. These phases are not reflections of the victim's worth or failures. They are strategic components of a manipulative cycle designed to maintain control. Naming them is a powerful step toward reclaiming emotional autonomy and finding peace beyond the cycle.
Chapter 17. How Gaslighting Twists Your Reality. Among the many tactics used in narcissistic abuse, gaslighting is often the most damaging, not because it leaves visible marks, but because it quietly dismantles a person's trust in their own mind. It is a slow, deliberate psychological process that turns certainty into doubt and confidence into confusion. The term gaslighting comes from an old stage play titled Gaslight, in which a husband subtly dims the gas lamps in their home while insisting to his wife that nothing has changed. Over time, she begins to question her own perception of reality, wondering whether her senses are betraying her. This metaphor captures the essence of gaslighting.
perfectly. In narcissistic relationships, gaslighting is used primarily to avoid accountability. When confronted with harmful behavior, the narcissist does not reflect or repair. Instead, they deny, distort, and reverse reality. Statements like, "I never said that," "You're imagining things," or "You're too sensitive" are repeated so often that they begin to feel believable. At first, the victim may push back. They remember what was said. They know what they felt. But repetition wears down resistance. When denial is constant and delivered with confidence, the mind begins to soften its grip on certainty. Small doubts appear. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe my memory is wrong. Over time, this erosion of trust becomes profound. Psychologists refer to this as a breakdown in reality testing, the ability to rely on one's own perceptions and judgments. The victim no longer feels confident interpreting events independently. Instead, they begin to look to the narcissist for confirmation of what is real. This is the true danger of gaslighting. It transfers cognitive authority from the victim to the abuser. When a person cannot trust their own thoughts, memories, or emotions, they become increasingly dependent on the narcissist's version of reality. Decision-making becomes paralyzing. Intuition is silenced. Even clear mistreatment can feel ambiguous. Gaslighting often escalates in subtle ways. The narcissist may deny entire conversations, minimize emotional injuries, or accuse the victim of being unstable for remembering painful events. An argument becomes proof that the victim is crazy. Hurt feelings are reframed as evidence of weakness. Reality itself becomes negotiable. Clinically, gaslighting is defined as a form of psychological manipulation in which one person systematically causes another to doubt their own memory, perception, or sanity. When sustained over time, it can lead to anxiety, depression, chronic self-doubt, and a sense of emotional paralysis. Victims may feel as though they are losing their grip on themselves. What makes gaslighting especially effective is its invisibility. From the outside, nothing dramatic appears to be happening, but internally, the victim is engaged in a constant battle with their own mind. Every thought is questioned, every feeling is second-guessed. The inner compass that once guided decisions begins to spin aimlessly. For the narcissist, this confusion is not accidental. A disoriented person is easier to control. If the victim doubts their own judgment, they are less likely to challenge mistreatment or leave the relationship. Gaslighting keeps the power imbalance firmly in place. Healing from gaslighting often begins with external grounding. Validation from trusted friends, written records, or a therapist can help re-establish reality. Slowly, the victim learns to trust their own perceptions again, to listen to their intuition, and to reclaim their inner authority. Understanding gaslighting for what it is can be deeply freeing. It allows survivors to see that the confusion they experienced was not a personal failing, but the result of sustained psychological manipulation. By naming the tactic, reality begins to stabilize, and the quiet war on the mind finally starts to lose its power.
Chapter 18. Creating Rivalry. Triangulation Tactics. Another subtle yet deeply destabilizing tactic in narcissistic abuse is known as triangulation. At its core, triangulation involves pulling a third person into what should be a direct relationship, not to resolve conflict, but to create confusion, insecurity, and control. In a healthy relationship, disagreements are addressed directly between the people involved. In narcissistic dynamics, however, direct communication feels threatening. Instead, the narcissist introduces another figure into the emotional space.
This third party might be a former partner, a friend, a sibling, a coworker, or sometimes even a stranger whose opinion is invoked as unquestionable truth. The narcissist may casually remark, "My ex never had a problem with this," or quietly add, "Even your brother thinks you're overreacting." These statements are rarely about the third person at all. Their real function is to destabilize the victim's sense of security and self-trust. By creating this triangle, the narcissist places themselves at the center. They become the judge, the reference point, and the prize. The victim is pushed into a position of comparison and competition, often without realizing it at first. Instead of addressing the original issue, the victim is now trying to prove their worth, defend their character, or win back approval. This manufactured competition breeds insecurity. The victim begins to feel replaceable, inadequate, or constantly evaluated. Jealousy and anxiety arise, not because of genuine rivalry, but because the narcissist has engineered the conditions for it. Attention shifts away from the narcissist's behavior and toward the victim's perceived shortcomings. Triangulation also serves to isolate. When a narcissist claims that others agree with them, the victim may feel outnumbered or ganged up on. This discourages open communication and makes the victim less likely to seek support. Even trusted relationships can become contaminated as the narcissist subtly poisons perceptions behind the scenes. In family systems, triangulation often appears as favoritism and division. One child may be idealized while another is criticized, creating rivalry rather than solidarity. Communication is routed through the narcissist, ensuring that misunderstandings persist and alliances never form. This dynamic underlies patterns such as the golden child and the scapegoat, where siblings are positioned against each other instead of supported as equals. In romantic relationships, triangulation may involve flirtation with others, comparisons to past partners, or sudden references to a new admirer. The narcissist may idealize someone else while simultaneously devaluing the current partner, casting one in light and the other in shadow. The message is subtle but powerful. You are replaceable, and you must compete to remain chosen. Psychologically, triangulation keeps everyone off balance. The narcissist avoids accountability by shifting attention outward. Conflict becomes perpetual but never resolvable because it is no longer about truth or understanding. It is about control. For the narcissist, triangulation reinforces power. As long as others are competing for approval, no one is united enough to challenge the manipulation. The narcissist remains central, influential, and emotionally untouchable. Recognizing triangulation can be an important step toward reclaiming clarity. It allows victims to step out of the manufactured contest and refuse the role of contestant. Healthy boundaries begin with insisting on direct communication and declining to engage in comparisons or third-party judgments. Understanding this tactic also helps protect other relationships from being quietly damaged. When triangulation loses its effect, the narcissist's ability to divide and dominate begins to weaken. And in that space, calm, direct, and grounded connection can slowly return, both within oneself and with others.
Chapter 19. Shifting Blame. Projection Explained. As we move deeper into the inner workings of narcissistic behavior, we arrive at two closely connected mechanisms that quietly reshape reality inside abusive relationships: projection and blame shifting. Together, they allow the narcissist to escape shame while placing the emotional burden squarely on someone else. Projection is, at its core, a way of disowning parts of the self that feel unbearable. Narcissists struggle deeply with acknowledging flaws, mistakes, or moral failures. Their self-image depends on seeing themselves as fundamentally good, superior, or justified. When evidence threatens that image, the mind looks for an escape. Instead of recognizing an uncomfortable truth internally, the narcissist unconsciously pushes it outward. Traits, urges, and behaviors they cannot tolerate in themselves are attributed to the victim. A narcissist who lies may accuse their partner of dishonesty. One who cheats may become obsessively suspicious, constantly questioning the partner's loyalty. Rage, manipulation, selfishness, and cruelty are all reassigned as though transferred from one psyche to another. This process is not merely a tactic of distraction. It is a psychological necessity. To remain emotionally intact, the narcissist must preserve the illusion of being blameless or all good. Shame threatens that illusion, and projection becomes the mechanism that expels it. The victim becomes a container for what the narcissist refuses to see. Blame shifting almost always follows. Even when confronted with clear evidence, the narcissist reframes the situation so responsibility lands elsewhere. Harmful actions are justified as reactions. I wouldn't have yelled if you hadn't provoked me. I cheated because you didn't give me enough attention. In these narratives, the narcissist is never the source of harm, only the responder. This reversal places the victim in a defensive position. Instead of addressing the abuse, they find themselves apologizing, explaining, and trying to soothe the narcissist to prevent further escalation. Over time, this dynamic trains the victim to accept responsibility for the narcissist's emotions and actions. Clinicians often note that projection and blame shifting are central tools of control. If the victim accepts the accusations, their self-confidence erodes. They begin to doubt their own character, questioning whether they truly are selfish, unstable, or cruel. As self-trust weakens, manipulation becomes easier. Psychological literature consistently describes this pattern. Narcissists are often unwilling or unable to reflect on their own shortcomings. Instead, they project, blame, and distort reality to protect a fragile self-esteem. This pattern is closely related to a response style known as Darvo. Deny the behavior, attack the accuser, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. In practice, this might sound like, "You're the real abuser," or "I'm sorry you feel that way." Statements that invalidate the victim's experience while positioning the narcissist as misunderstood or unfairly attacked. The original issue is lost beneath layers of deflection. For survivors, recognizing projection can be profoundly freeing. It allows them to separate who they are from what they are accused of being. When patterns repeat across time, the accusations begin to reveal more about the accuser than the target. Healing often involves learning to pause and ask a simple question: is this truly mine to carry? By examining behavior objectively and seeking external reality checks, victims can slowly reclaim their sense of self. The accusations lose their power when they are seen not as truths, but as reflections of someone else's unresolved inner conflict. Understanding projection and blame shifting does not make the experience less painful, but it does restore clarity. It reminds survivors that they were not failing moral tests, but standing in the path of a defense mechanism that could not tolerate honesty. And with that clarity comes the possibility of stepping out of the reflection and back into one's own grounded reality.
Chapter 20. False Promises, Future-Faking Tricks. One of the most quietly powerful tools in narcissistic manipulation is something known as future-faking. Unlike overt abuse, it does not rely on fear or intimidation. Instead, it works through hope. It offers a vision of tomorrow so compelling that the present becomes easier to endure. Future faking is the act of promising a future that the narcissist has little intention or ability to create. These promises can sound deeply meaningful: marriage, children, a shared home, financial stability, or a peaceful life once things settle down. Each promise is carefully shaped to match the victim's deepest longings. What makes future faking especially effective is its emotional timing. These promises often appear precisely when the victim begins to question the relationship or express dissatisfaction. Just as doubt emerges, the narcissist redirects attention forward. Instead of addressing current harm, they invite the victim to imagine how wonderful things will eventually be. Psychologically, the promise itself becomes a form of narcissistic supply. In the moment it is spoken, the narcissist may even believe it. Saying it feels good. It restores admiration, reassurance, and control. The future is treated not as a responsibility, but as a tool for immediate gratification. The difficulty lies in follow-through. Narcissists lack the patience, discipline, or emotional consistency required to build what they promise. When the time comes to act, the commitment dissolves. The promise is denied, minimized, or reframed. "I never said that. You misunderstood. It would have happened if you hadn't ruined things." Meanwhile, the victim remains emotionally invested. Time passes. Years may pass. Decisions are postponed. Opportunities are deferred. The relationship is sustained not by what is happening, but by what might happen someday. Hope becomes a leash. Future faking is especially damaging because it hijacks a natural human instinct. Believing in a shared future is a cornerstone of intimacy. Narcissistic manipulation turns that instinct against the victim, keeping them tethered to an illusion rather than a lived reality. Counselors often describe this dynamic as a paradoxical trap. The more the victim is hurt, the more they cling to the promise. Leaving feels impossible because it would mean abandoning not just a person, but a dream they have emotionally inhabited for so long. Over time, this pattern strengthens trauma bonding. Each promise creates a brief emotional high, followed by disappointment and confusion. The cycle of hope and despair repeats, reinforcing attachment rather than breaking it. Recognizing future faking requires shifting focus from words to patterns. Promises that are sincere leave traces. Plans move forward. Actions follow language. When vows are repeatedly made but never realized, the pattern itself becomes the truth. Healing often begins when the future is no longer allowed to excuse the present. By grounding decisions in what consistently happens rather than what is promised, victims begin to reclaim their time, agency, and emotional clarity. Understanding future faking does not mean giving up on hope. It means choosing hope that is rooted in reality, where tomorrow grows naturally from today, and where promises are carried by action rather than illusion. Chapter 21. Inside a Narcissistic Family. Hidden Control. To truly understand how narcissism shapes lives, it helps to look beyond the individual and into the family systems where it often takes root. A narcissistic family does not function like a nurturing home. It operates more like a tightly controlled system, where emotional power flows in only one direction. At the center of this system is the narcissistic parent. Everything revolves around their needs, moods, and image. The family exists to regulate their self-esteem and protect their public reputation. Harmony is not measured by emotional safety or mutual care, but by how well the family appears to outsiders. Behind closed doors, neglect, chaos, and emotional volatility are carefully hidden. In this environment, boundaries are either blurred or outright forbidden. Children are not encouraged to develop independent thoughts, preferences, or identities. Any sign of individuality can be interpreted as disloyalty or betrayal. The unspoken rule is simple: you exist to serve the system, not yourself. A common phrase in such households is some version of "what will people think?" On the surface, this sounds like concern for manners or reputation. In reality, it signals that appearances matter more than truth. Pain must be concealed, conflict must be denied, the family image must remain intact, no matter the emotional cost to its members. Children in narcissistic families are not loved for who they are. They are valued for the roles they play. These roles are assigned early and enforced rigidly, though they can shift unpredictably. One child may be elevated as the golden child, celebrated as the embodiment of the parent's ideal qualities. Another may become the scapegoat, blamed for problems and burdened with the traits the parent cannot tolerate in themselves. These roles are not reflections of the children's true personalities. They are projections. The narcissistic parent splits their own self-image into all good and all bad parts and assigns those parts to different children. In doing so, the parent avoids confronting their own complexity, while maintaining control over the family narrative. The result is an atmosphere of competition and insecurity. Siblings are subtly or overtly pitted against one another, encouraged to compete for conditional approval. Affection is inconsistent and unpredictable. A child who is praised one day may be criticized or ignored the next, often without explanation. This divide-and-conquer dynamic ensures that no child feels fully safe or unified with the others. Alliances shift, trust erodes, silence and secrecy become survival strategies. Children learn to monitor the emotional climate constantly, adjusting themselves to avoid punishment or abandonment. Over time, this environment shapes deep psychological patterns. Many children become people pleasers, hyper-attuned to others' needs while neglecting their own. Others withdraw emotionally, learning that invisibility feels safer than authenticity. Codependency often develops as love becomes equated with self-sacrifice and compliance. Therapists note that growing up in a narcissistic family can create trauma bonds that persist into adulthood. Loyalty to the family system may remain strong even when it causes harm. Guilt, obligation, and fear can make separation feel impossible. Healing from such a background is not quick or simple. It often involves untangling deeply ingrained roles, questioning long-held beliefs about duty and love, and slowly building a sense of self that exists outside the family's expectations. Survivors must learn that their worth does not depend on performance, perfection, or appeasing others. Understanding the narcissistic family system helps explain why leaving it can feel so disorienting. It is not just a family one walks away from, but an entire structure that once defined reality. And yet, beyond that structure lies the possibility of a life shaped by choice, authenticity, and emotional freedom, where identity is no longer a betrayal, but a birthright.
Chapter 22. Being the Golden Child, the Real Cost. Within a narcissistic family system, the role of the golden child often appears, at least on the surface, to be the most fortunate position. This child is singled out, admired, and elevated as a living extension of the narcissistic parent's ideal self. Their successes are celebrated not as their own, but as proof of the parent's superiority. The golden child is praised generously, sometimes excessively, and often exempted from rules that apply to others. They are displayed as trophies, held up as evidence of exceptional genes, perfect parenting, or moral superiority. To outsiders, the family may appear proud and supportive. Inside the home, however, the conditions of this admiration are quietly enforced. Love in this role is never unconditional. Approval depends on performance. The child learns early that they are valued not for who they are, but how well they reflect the parent's desired image. Achievements in school, sports, or social standing are encouraged, but only insofar as they enhance the parent's sense of greatness. This creates immense internal pressure. The golden child grows up feeling that perfection is not optional. Mistakes are dangerous. Failure threatens not just disappointment, but emotional withdrawal. The parent's praise can vanish as quickly as it appears, replaced by coldness or criticism if expectations are not met. Enmeshment often develops in this dynamic. Boundaries between parent and child blur. The child's thoughts, ambitions, and identity are subtly shaped to align with the parent's needs. Independence may be discouraged or framed as disloyalty. Over time, the child may struggle to distinguish their own desires from the role they have been trained to perform. Although the golden child is often shielded from overt abuse, the psychological cost is significant. Many grow into adulthood with deep perfectionism, chronic anxiety, or a fear of being exposed as not good enough. They may feel compelled to succeed at all costs, driven by an internalized belief that worth must be earned. Paradoxically, some golden children also develop a sense of entitlement or superiority. Having been told they are special and exceptional, they may carry this belief into relationships, expecting preferential treatment. In some cases, narcissistic traits emerge, as the child unconsciously adopts the values modeled by the parent. Others move in the opposite direction, becoming people pleasers who struggle with boundaries and self-worth. They learned to survive by anticipating needs, meeting expectations, and avoiding disappointment. Their achievements feel hollow, disconnected from an authentic sense of self. In therapy, golden child survivors often arrive with a quiet but profound question: who am I without the crown? Stripped of roles and praise, many feel uncertain about their identity. They may wrestle with imposter syndrome, sensing that past validation was conditional and fragile. Healing involves learning that value does not depend on performance, comparison, or perfection. It requires separating personal worth from parental projections and rediscovering interests, limits, and emotions that were once overshadowed by expectation. Understanding the golden child helps dissolve the illusion of privilege. Beneath the admiration lies a child who was never truly seen, only displayed. And beyond that role lies the possibility of becoming someone whole, imperfect, and worthy,
simply by being human.
Chapter 23. The Scapegoat. Carrying Family Blame.
Within a narcissistic family system, someone must carry what the parent cannot bear. That role belongs to the scapegoat. This child becomes the emotional dumping ground for the family's unresolved pain, shame, and conflict. Everything that feels unacceptable to the narcissistic parent is quietly and sometimes violently placed onto them. The scapegoat is blamed for what goes wrong in the family. If there is tension, it is their fault. If there is conflict, they are accused of causing it. If the family feels unhappy or unstable, the scapegoat becomes the explanation. Labels like difficult, rebellious, or crazy are used not to describe behavior accurately, but to justify rejection. Psychologically, this role serves an important function for the narcissistic parent. By projecting their own aggression, failures, and self-loathing onto one child, the parent protects their fragile self-image. The family's dysfunction is no longer something to be examined. It has a name, a face, and a target. From an early age, the scapegoat learns that love is unpredictable and often withheld. Even ordinary behavior may be criticized or punished. Boundaries are interpreted as defiance. Emotional reactions are treated as proof of instability. Over time, the child may internalize the belief that they are inherently flawed or unlovable. And yet, there is a painful paradox at the heart of this role. The scapegoat is often the healthiest member of the family. They are frequently the one who senses that something is wrong, who questions unfair rules, or who refuses to participate fully in the family's shared denial. In many cases, they become the truth teller. Because they are devalued rather than idealized, the scapegoat is often less emotionally enmeshed with the narcissistic parent than the golden child. This distance, though deeply painful, can offer clarity. It allows the scapegoat to see the dysfunction more clearly, and in some cases, to seek escape or healing earlier in life. However, this clarity comes at a cost. Rejection wounds deeply. Growing up as the scapegoat often leaves lasting scars of betrayal, loneliness, and grief. Many carry a persistent sense of guilt even when they have done nothing wrong. Praise may feel uncomfortable. Success may feel undeserved. Self-doubt can linger long after the family has been left behind. Psychologists observe that former scapegoats may grow into chronic people-pleasers, endlessly trying to prove their worth, or into individuals who expect blame and rejection in relationships. Others may struggle with anger, distrust, or a feeling of being fundamentally different from others. These patterns are not flaws, they are adaptations to an unjust environment. Some scapegoats rebel openly or leave the family system entirely. When this happens, the narcissistic parent often reinforces the narrative, casting the child as bad or evil to preserve the illusion that the family remains intact. The departure is reframed as betrayal rather than survival. Healing for the scapegoat begins with a profound realization. The shame they carry was never theirs. It was assigned. Therapy frequently focuses on building self-compassion, untangling false guilt, and separating identity from the labels imposed in childhood. Understanding the scapegoat role can be deeply validating. It reframes a lifetime of blame as a reflection of systemic dysfunction, not personal failure. And in that reframing, many survivors begin to reclaim something that was denied to them early on. The quiet certainty that they were never broken, only burdened. In stepping out of the role, the scapegoat does more than heal themselves. They break a cycle. And in that act, they transform pain into awareness and survival into strength. Chapter 24. Fading Away. The invisible child's story. In a narcissistic family system, not every child is loudly praised or openly blamed. Some survive by becoming nearly invisible. This child is often called the invisible child or the lost child, and their strategy for survival is quiet withdrawal. From an early age, the invisible child learns that attention is risky. Being noticed can invite criticism, conflict, or emotional chaos. So they adapt by shrinking themselves. They stay out of the way, avoid strong opinions, and make as few demands as possible. Silence feels safer than expression. This child often retreats into solitary activities. Books, imagination, daydreaming, or private hobbies become places of refuge. These inner worlds offer a sense of control and comfort that the external family environment cannot provide. While other siblings are caught in visible battles for approval or blame, the invisible child fades into the background. Unlike the golden child, they receive little praise. Unlike the scapegoat, they are not directly attacked. Instead, they experience something quieter and often more painful: emotional neglect. Their presence is overlooked. Their feelings are rarely asked about. Their needs are unacknowledged, not because they are small, but because the system has no room for them. Over time, the invisible child learns a powerful but damaging lesson. Their needs feel like burdens. Their voice feels unnecessary. They begin to believe that taking up space is selfish or dangerous. To survive, they suppress their wants and adapt themselves to whatever keeps the peace. Therapists often note that invisible children grow up with a deep sense that they do not matter. Many describe an inner emptiness, as though a part of their identity was never fully formed. Because they were rarely mirrored or responded to, they struggle to recognize themselves clearly. As adults, these patterns often persist. Invisible children may have difficulty asserting boundaries or expressing preferences. They may struggle to name what they want, or even what they feel. Relationships can feel confusing, especially when attention is offered freely. Being seen may feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Many drift into relationships where they are overlooked or emotionally sidelined, not because they want to be ignored, but because the dynamic feels familiar and strangely safe. Neglect becomes normalized. Intimacy may feel elusive, not due to lack of care, but due to a lifelong habit of self-erasure. At the same time, invisible children often develop deep empathy. Growing up quietly observing emotional undercurrents, they become highly attuned to others' moods and needs. They are often thoughtful listeners and sensitive companions, though this sensitivity may come at the cost of neglecting themselves. Healing for the invisible child involves gently reclaiming what was set aside, learning that their needs are valid, that their voice matters, that they are allowed to take up space without earning it through silence or self-sacrifice. Recovery often focuses on rebuilding identity. This can include therapy that encourages self-expression, boundary setting, and connection with others who reflect their worth. Group settings or supportive communities can be especially powerful, offering the experience of being seen and valued without condition. Understanding the invisible child role reframes a lifetime of quiet coping. What once looked like passivity was actually adaptation. What felt like emptiness was shaped by neglect, not lack of substance. And beneath the habit of disappearing lies a person who has always been there, waiting to be acknowledged, not by a demanding system, but by themselves.
Chapter 25. Unwanted Habits, Narcissistic Fleas. When people grow up or spend long periods in close contact with narcissistic individuals, something subtle often happens. In order to survive, they adapt. Over time, these adaptations can begin to resemble the very behaviors that once harmed them. This phenomenon is often referred to as narcissistic fleas, a term drawn from the saying, "If you lie down with dogs, you get fleas." Narcissistic fleas are not a personality disorder. They are learned survival responses. They develop when someone lives in an environment where emotional safety is unpredictable, where blame is common, and where self-protection is necessary. Especially for children raised by narcissistic parents, these behaviors can become second nature. A child may learn to become defensive before being attacked. They may lie, not out of malice, but to avoid punishment or emotional explosions. Emotional reactivity can develop because calm communication was never effective. In some cases, survivors may even experience brief episodes of rage, mirroring what they observed, simply because that was the only model of emotional expression available to them. What makes fleas so confusing is that they can feel deeply distressing to the person experiencing them. Unlike narcissistic traits, which are rigid and defended, fleas are often followed by guilt, shame, and self-reflection. Survivors typically feel unsettled by their own reactions. They worry about hurting others. They question themselves. Many become terrified that they are narcissistic themselves. This fear is an important distinction. People with narcissistic personality disorder generally deny their behavior and externalize blame. Survivors with fleas do the opposite. They look inward. They feel remorse. They want to change. The capacity for empathy and accountability remains intact. Psychologically, narcissistic fleas are best understood as conditioned responses. They once served a purpose. They helped someone survive an unsafe relational environment. But once the environment changes, those same behaviors can feel out of place, even damaging. This is why distance from the abusive dynamic is so important. When the nervous system is no longer constantly on alert, these behaviors begin to soften. Therapy can help survivors identify which reactions truly belong to them and which were borrowed from the past. Cognitive and relational therapies often focus on replacing defensive habits with healthier tools, such as assertive communication, emotional regulation, and boundary setting. Attachment theory helps explain why fleas are so common. Humans learn how to relate by watching and experiencing close relationships early in life. When manipulation, blame, or emotional volatility are normalized, those patterns can be unconsciously repeated. Healing does not require shame for having learned them. It requires awareness and compassion. Support groups for adult children of narcissists often focus on this very process. Survivors share experiences, recognize patterns, and gently separate their authentic selves from inherited coping strategies. Over time, they learn that behaviors adopted for survival do not define who they are. Unlike narcissistic personality disorder, fleas are not permanent. They can be unlearned. With reflection, support, and patience, survivors can shed what no longer serves them and rebuild ways of relating that feel grounded, honest, and kind. Understanding narcissistic fleas can bring relief. It reframes troubling behaviors not as proof of corruption, but as evidence of resilience. They are signs that someone adapted to survive. And, just as they were learned, they can be released, leaving space for a self shaped not by fear, but by choice.
Chapter 26. Narcissism at Work. Seeking Power. The modern workplace, with its hierarchies, competition, and emphasis on status, often provides fertile ground for narcissistic behavior. Titles, authority, and visibility offer ready-made sources of validation, making professional environments especially appealing to those who rely on external admiration to sustain their self-image. A
A narcissistic boss or leader typically uses their position as a tool for extracting narcissistic supply. Praise, recognition, and loyalty are expected as a given, while accountability is quietly avoided. Successes are claimed as personal triumphs, even when they are the result of collective effort. Failures, on the other hand, are quickly redirected towards subordinates, who are blamed individually to preserve the leader's image of competence. These leaders often demand unwavering loyalty. Agreement is rewarded, dissent is interpreted as betrayal. Yet this loyalty is never reciprocal. Employees are valued only as long as they serve the narcissist's goals or reinforce their authority. When they no longer do so, they may be marginalized, criticized, or quietly pushed out. In many cases, narcissistic leaders engage in workplace mobbing. A particular employee, often a high performer or someone with strong integrity, is singled out as a threat. Through subtle comments, selective information sharing, or overt criticism, the leader incites others to join in isolating the target. What appears to be group consensus is often carefully orchestrated triangulation. This creates a culture of fear and paranoia. Colleagues are pitted against one another. Trust erodes. People become cautious about speaking openly, worried that private conversations may be relayed or distorted. Energy that should be devoted to meaningful work is instead spent managing perceptions and avoiding conflict. Narcissistic colleagues without formal authority can be equally disruptive. They may sabotage others by withholding information, spreading rumors, or taking credit for shared work. Advancement becomes a performance rather than a collaboration. These individuals often dominate conversations, using meetings as stages for self-promotion or complaint, draining time and morale. Research in organizational psychology highlights the paradox of narcissism in leadership. Narcissistic individuals often rise quickly because of their confidence, charm, and bold vision. In the short term, teams may feel energized by a strong personality at the helm. Employees can experience a sense of momentum, believing they are part of something important. However, this energy comes at a cost. Studies show that while narcissistic leaders can increase engagement initially, they also generate resentment, hostility, and counterproductive behavior over time. When admiration fades or pressure increases, the leader's defensiveness and blame shifting intensify. Ethical lapses, bullying, and high turnover frequently follow. Human resources research consistently finds that teams under narcissistic management report elevated stress levels. Loyalty is rewarded, but honesty is punished. Innovation suffers because mistakes are not tolerated. Trust collapses because fairness is inconsistent. The workplace becomes emotionally unsafe. Some observers note that certain grandiose traits, such as decisiveness or self-belief, can be adaptive in limited contexts, but the distinction between confidence and pathological narcissism is critical. When self-interest overrides empathy and accountability, organizational health deteriorates. Over time, workplaces dominated by narcissistic dynamics tend to burn out their most capable employees. What remains is often a culture of compliance rather than excellence. Productivity may continue on the surface, but morale, creativity, and psychological safety erode quietly beneath. Understanding narcissism in the workplace helps individuals make sense of experiences that might otherwise feel personal or confusing. It clarifies why hard work is overlooked, why credit disappears, and why environments can feel tense without obvious cause. With this understanding comes the possibility of setting boundaries, seeking healthier teams, or choosing leadership styles rooted not in ego, but in mutual respect and trust.
In the end, while narcissism may drive short-term ambition, it is collaboration, integrity, and empathy that sustain organizations over time.
Chapter 27. The Hidden Mask. Narcissism versus Psychopathy. To understand the deeper landscape of personality disorders, it is helpful to look at an idea introduced in the mid-20th century by psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley. He described what he called the mask of sanity, a concept originally used to explain psychopathy. It referred to individuals who appear outwardly normal, charming, and socially skilled, yet lack genuine emotional depth beneath the surface. This idea also helps illuminate the overlap and the crucial differences between narcissism and psychopathy. While the two can look similar on the outside, especially in their more severe forms, what lies beneath the mask is very different. There is no question that narcissism and psychopathy share traits. Both may involve grandiosity, entitlement, manipulation, and a lack of empathy. In malignant forms of narcissism, the overlap can be especially striking. Yet clinicians consistently point to one defining distinction: emotional need. The narcissist is driven by anxiety and dependence. Beneath their confidence lies a fragile self that requires constant validation from the outside. Approval, admiration, and attention are not luxuries for them, but necessities. Without these, their sense of identity begins to fracture. Shame is a constant threat, and much of the narcissist's behavior is organized around avoiding it. This is why narcissists react so intensely to perceived insults. When their self-image is challenged, the response is often rage, collapse, or desperation. The anger is not calculated, it is emotional, reactive, and fueled by hurt. Even at their most aggressive, narcissists remain emotionally alive. They feel deeply, even if those feelings are disorganized and overwhelming. The psychopath, by contrast, operates from emotional absence rather than emotional instability. Anxiety is low, shame is minimal or non-existent. They do not need admiration to feel whole because there is no fragile self to protect. Other people are not sources of emotional regulation, they are instruments. Where a narcissist needs others to mirror their worth, a psychopath views others through the lens of utility. People are useful, inconvenient, or irrelevant. If someone becomes an obstacle, the response is not emotional injury, but cold calculation. Harm is inflicted not out of wounded pride, but because it serves a purpose. This difference is often visible in how each responds to conflict. A narcissist may erupt when insulted because the insult cuts deeply. A psychopath may respond with indifference or with carefully planned retaliation, not because they feel hurt, but because the situation demands correction. Bonding also reveals the divide. Narcissists can form intense dependent attachments. These bonds are often unhealthy, rooted in trauma and control, but they are still bonds. The narcissist needs connection, even if it sabotages it. Psychopaths, however, are fundamentally incapable of attachment. Emotional closeness has no intrinsic value to them. Relationships are transactional from the beginning. Clinicians sometimes explain the difference through metaphor. When the narcissist's mask slips, what is revealed is a frightened, furious, shame-ridden inner child, desperate to be seen and affirmed. When the psychopath's mask slips, there is often nothing comparable beneath it. No panic, no grief, no longing. Just emptiness, calculation, and predation. Research and clinical observation support this distinction. Narcissists crave status, admiration, and recognition. Psychopaths seek power, material gain, or stimulation, with little concern for social approval. Both may manipulate, but their motivations differ profoundly. Understanding this difference matters, especially for those trying to make sense of confusing or frightening relationships. It explains why some individuals react emotionally when challenged, while others remain chillingly calm. It also clarifies why not all charming, manipulative people are the same beneath the surface. Both narcissism and psychopathy wear convincing masks, but what those masks conceal could not be more different. One hides a fragile self that cannot survive without reflection. The other hides an absence where emotional life was meant to be. And in recognizing that difference, clarity quietly begins to replace confusion.
Chapter 28. Why Love Feels Addictive. Trauma Bonding. One of the most painful questions survivors of abuse are often asked is, why didn't you just leave? On the surface, it may sound reasonable, but beneath that question lies a misunderstanding of what trauma bonding really is and how deeply it reshapes the mind and body. A trauma bond is not a failure of logic or strength. It is a powerful emotional attachment formed through a cycle of harm mixed with moments of relief and affection. This pattern is known in psychology as intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the strongest conditioning mechanisms the human brain can experience. Intermittent reinforcement means that rewards arrive unpredictably. In behavioral science, this is the same principle that makes slot machines so addictive. You never know when the next win will come, so you keep pulling the lever. In abusive relationships, the lever is hope. Periods of cruelty, neglect, or fear are followed by sudden kindness, an apology, a tender moment, a promise that things will change. These moments feel intensely meaningful because they arrive after pain. The relief is so strong that it imprints deeply on the nervous system. Over time, the victim's brain begins to associate the abuser with both danger and safety. The emotional highs are fueled by chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin, which reinforce attachment and bonding. The lows are driven by stress hormones like cortisol, which create anxiety, hypervigilance, and fear. This creates a devastating paradox. The abuser becomes the source of the pain, but also the only perceived source of comfort. When abuse occurs, the victim longs for relief. When relief arrives, it feels life-saving. Love and fear become chemically intertwined. This is why trauma bonding is often described as an addiction. The body craves the brief moments of connection that soothe the stress response. Even when the mind understands that the relationship is harmful, the nervous system is still seeking regulation. As the bond deepens, cognitive dissonance sets in. The victim holds two conflicting truths at once. This person hurts me, and this person loves me. To reduce the unbearable tension between these realities, the mind often protects the abuser. Excuses are made, blame is internalized, the abuse is minimized. This is not weakness, it is survival. Clinicians observe that trauma bonds form most strongly when there is a power imbalance, emotional intensity, and inconsistent treatment. This pattern mirrors what is sometimes called Stockholm Syndrome, where attachment forms in the presence of threat. The bond is not built on safety, but on relief from danger. Breaking a trauma bond is not just emotionally painful, it can be physically distressing. When contact ends, the body may go into withdrawal. Anxiety spikes, sleep is disrupted, thoughts become obsessive. Some people experience shaking, panic, or a sense of emptiness that feels unbearable.
This is why leaving an abusive relationship is rarely a single decision. Research shows that many survivors attempt to leave multiple times before they are able to separate permanently. Each return is not a failure, but a sign of how powerful the bond has become. Understanding trauma bonding changes the narrative. It explains why leaving feels impossible even when abuse is obvious. It reframes loyalty as a symptom of conditioning, not proof of love or compatibility. Healing involves slowly untangling fear from affection. With support, therapy, and time, the nervous system can relearn what safety feels like without chaos. Gradual emotional and cognitive withdrawal allows the brain's reward pathways to reset. As survivors regain stability, the bond begins to loosen. What once felt irresistible starts to feel painful rather than comforting. Clarity replaces confusion. Compassion replaces self-blame. Trauma bonding does not mean someone was weak. It meant they were human, wired for attachment, and placed in an environment that exploited that wiring. And with understanding, patience, and care, that wiring can heal, allowing connection to once again feel safe, steady, and real.
Chapter 29. Life After Harm, Victim Syndrome, and C-PTSD. When someone lives for a long time under narcissistic abuse, the damage does not end when the relationship ends. The nervous system remembers. The mind adapts in ways that once made survival possible, but later make peace feel distant. This is why many survivors develop what clinicians recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, often shortened to C-PTSD. Unlike classic PTSD, which usually follows a single overwhelming event, such as an accident or a natural disaster, C-PTSD grows slowly. It develops through repeated long-term trauma, especially in situations where escape felt unsafe, impossible, or emotionally costly. Narcissistic abuse fits this pattern precisely. It is not one explosion, but thousands of small cuts to safety, identity, and trust. Some professionals use the term narcissistic victim syndrome. It is not a formal medical diagnosis, but it describes a very real and consistent cluster of symptoms seen in survivors. What matters is not the label, but the recognition that prolonged narcissistic abuse is traumatic in the deepest psychological sense. One of the most common experiences survivors describe is something called emotional flashbacks. These are not visual memories of specific events. Instead, they are sudden floods of emotion. Fear, shame, panic, or helplessness can surge without warning. A harmless tone of voice, a delayed reply, or a neutral facial expression may trigger the same feelings the survivor once felt during abuse. The body reacts before the mind can explain why. Another hallmark is toxic shame. This is not ordinary guilt over something done wrong. Toxic shame is the belief that something is wrong with who you are. Survivors may feel fundamentally defective, unlovable, or broken, even when there is no rational evidence for these beliefs. Often, this shame is not self-generated. It is the internal echo of years of criticism, blame, and emotional invalidation. Hypervigilance is also common. The nervous system stays on constant alert, scanning for danger, mood shifts, or signs of disapproval. This vigilance once protected the survivor by helping them anticipate the abuser's reactions. After the abuse ends, it becomes exhausting. Rest feels unsafe. Calm feels unfamiliar. Over time, many survivors experience identity erosion. Their preferences, opinions, and sense of agency may feel blurred or absent. Years of being told what to think, feel, or want can leave a person unsure of who they are when no one is controlling them. Simple questions like, "What do I want?" or "What do I enjoy?" can feel surprisingly difficult. This loss of autonomy often connects to executive dysfunction. Planning, decision-making, and initiating tasks can feel overwhelming. This is not laziness or lack of intelligence. In abusive environments, independent action was often punished or mocked. The brain learned that taking initiative was dangerous. Even after safety returns, the nervous system may still hesitate. Clinicians note that survivors frequently meet diagnostic criteria for C-PTSD. They may experience anxiety, avoidance, emotional numbing, intrusive thoughts, and an inner critic that sounds remarkably like their former abuser. Nightmares, sleep disturbances, and persistent self-doubt are also common. Understanding this framework is profoundly important. It shifts the story from "why can't I just get over it" to "my mind and body adapted to long-term trauma." That reframing alone can reduce shame and self-blame. Trauma-informed therapy is often essential for healing. Effective treatment does not focus only on surface coping skills, but on restoring safety to the nervous system, rebuilding identity, and gently separating the survivor's true voice from the internalized voice of abuse. In this light, narcissistic victim syndrome is not a weakness, it is evidence of endurance. It shows what the human psyche does to survive sustained emotional harm. And just as with other forms of trauma, recovery is possible. With understanding, validation, and support, survivors can gradually reclaim agency, rebuild trust in themselves, and learn what safety feels like again. Healing from narcissistic abuse is not about erasing the past. It is about teaching the nervous system that the danger is over and that the self that was once silenced is still very much alive.
Chapter 30. Conflicting Feelings. Cognitive Dissonance. As the day quiets and the mind begins to slow, it can be helpful to understand one of the most exhausting inner experiences survivors of narcissistic abuse carry with them. This experience is known as cognitive dissonance, and it plays a powerful role in keeping people trapped in harmful relationships far longer than they ever imagined they would stay. Cognitive dissonance is the deep mental discomfort that arises when we hold two opposing beliefs at the same time. In narcissistic relationships, these beliefs are not abstract ideas, they are lived realities that collide every day. On one side of the mind lives the belief that this person loves me, that they are special, that they are my soulmate, the one who truly sees me. On the other side lives a much darker truth. This same person frightens me, humiliates me, controls me, or hurts me emotionally. Both realities feel real, and yet they cannot logically coexist. The human mind is not built to tolerate this level of contradiction for long. The tension becomes unbearable. Something has to give. And very often, what gives is not the relationship, but the victim's interpretation of reality. To ease this inner conflict, the mind begins to explain away the abuse. The victim may tell themselves that the cruelty was not intentional, that it was caused by stress, exhaustion, or outside pressure. They may believe that they somehow provoked the outburst, or that if they behave better, love will return and the pain will stop. These thoughts are not signs of weakness or denial, they are survival strategies. By softening the meaning of the abuse, the mind protects itself from a devastating conclusion that the person it loves is also the source of fear. Accepting that truth too early can feel emotionally catastrophic, so the mind chooses a version of reality that allows the relationship to continue, even if it costs clarity and self-trust. This process is intensified by the way narcissistic abuse unfolds. Survivors are often told one thing one day only to have it completely denied the next. Warmth is followed by coldness. Affection is followed by punishment. Promises are made and then erased. Over time, this inconsistency creates profound confusion. The victim may begin to question their own memory, their own judgment, and even their own sanity. Inside, a quiet question keeps repeating. Is this person truly loving and misunderstood, or are they deeply harmful? The effort to reconcile these two images consumes enormous mental energy. It leads to constant self-doubt, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. Ironically, the discomfort of cognitive dissonance can make leaving even harder because the mind keeps searching for a way to make the contradictions resolve without losing the relationship. Healing begins when the survivor slowly learns to trust their own perceptions again. This is not a sudden realization, but a gradual return to inner stability. Many therapists encourage survivors to write things down, to talk through events with trusted friends or professionals, and to gently reality check moments that once felt confusing. These practices help anchor memory and rebuild confidence in one's own experience. Perhaps the most painful step in resolving cognitive dissonance is accepting that the loving version of the narcissist was not the full picture. It was often a mask, worn selectively and withdrawn when control was secure. Letting go of that image can feel like mourning a relationship that never truly existed. But with that grief comes relief. As the mind no longer has to hold two opposing realities at once, clarity slowly returns. The nervous system begins to rest, and the survivor can start rebuilding a sense of truth that belongs to them, steady, grounded, and no longer shaped by fear. Understanding cognitive dissonance does not erase the pain of what happened, but it does offer something deeply comforting: the knowledge that confusion was not a failure of intelligence or strength. It was the mind doing its best to survive a situation that should never have required survival at all.
Chapter 31. Abuse that lingers after leaving.
When a relationship with a narcissist ends, many people hope that the conflict will finally settle into silence. They imagine that distance will bring peace, that separation will naturally close the door on harm. But for many survivors, the opposite happens. The relationship may be over, yet the abuse does not end. Instead, it quietly changes shape. This phase is often called post-separation abuse. It is not random or accidental. It is the narcissist's attempt to regain control after losing direct access to the person they once dominated. For a narcissist, separation is not simply a breakup. It is a profound injury to their sense of power. Psychologists describe this as a loss of control injury, and it can provoke behavior that is even more intense than what came before. During the relationship, the narcissist had daily influence. They could manipulate conversations, emotions, routines, and finances with relative ease. After separation, that access disappears, and so the battleground shifts. The abuse moves outward into systems, institutions, and shared responsibilities, especially when there are legal or parental ties that make complete separation difficult. One common tactic is legal abuse, sometimes called lawfare. This happens when legal processes are weaponized to exhaust and intimidate. A narcissist may file repeated motions with little substance, drag out divorce proceedings for years, or force unnecessary court appearances. Each document, each delay, and each hearing becomes another way to drain time, energy, and money. The goal is rarely resolution. The goal is pressure. By overwhelming the survivor financially and emotionally, the narcissist attempts to reassert dominance through the legal system itself.
Financial abuse often continues alongside this. Assets may be hidden or deliberately obscured. Court-ordered support may be withheld or paid inconsistently. Credit may be damaged through unpaid joint accounts or deliberate financial sabotage. Even after separation, money remains a tool of control, creating instability and anxiety long after the relationship has ended. Stalking and harassment are also common in this phase. Some survivors notice a constant sense of being watched. The narcissist may drive past their home, appear unexpectedly in familiar places, or monitor their online presence. In the digital age, cyberstalking adds another layer, with constant messages, tracking through social media, or the misuse of shared accounts and devices. Even when no words are spoken, the message is clear: you are still being monitored. For survivors who share children with a narcissist, post-separation abuse often takes a particularly painful form through counterparenting. Children may be used as tools rather than treated as individuals with emotional needs. The narcissist may undermine household rules, present themselves as the fun or permissive parent, or subtly turn children against the other parent through manipulation and alienation. Parenting decisions become battlegrounds, not because of concern for the child, but because they provide continued access to control. What makes this phase especially difficult is that many systems are not well equipped to recognize it. Courts and professionals often describe these situations as high-conflict relationships, implying equal responsibility on both sides. In doing so, they may overlook the presence of a pattern of abuse. This mislabeling can unintentionally protect the abuser, especially when shared parenting or frequent contact is encouraged without sufficient safeguards. Research in domestic violence has long warned that separation is one of the most dangerous periods in an abusive relationship. Studies such as those by Campbell and colleagues have shown that leaving an abuser can significantly increase the risk of escalation, sometimes with lethal consequences. Even when physical violence does not occur, survivors frequently report relentless harassment. Sudden legal disputes, false accusations, smear campaigns, or constant communication attempts can make it feel as though the relationship never truly ended. In some cases, narcissists also attempt to sabotage new relationships. They may spread rumors, interfere with social connections, or provoke crises whenever the survivor begins to regain independence. Each new step toward freedom can trigger another attempt to pull the survivor back into chaos. Because of this, clinicians and advocates emphasize the importance of safety planning after separation. Survivors are often advised to assume that the narcissist may become punitive once control is lost. Careful documentation of incidents, legal protections such as restraining orders when appropriate, and strong support networks are not signs of overreaction. They are practical responses to a known pattern of behavior. Most importantly, recognizing post-separation abuse helps survivors make sense of what they are experiencing. It validates the confusion many feel when abuse continues even after they have left. Understanding that this behavior is part of a predictable pattern rather than a personal failure or coincidence can be deeply grounding. Leaving a narcissist rarely ends the story immediately. For many, true safety and emotional closure require firm, decisive boundaries. In some cases, this means ending contact entirely when possible, a strategy explored further in Chapter 34 on no contact. While the path after separation can be long and demanding, awareness is a powerful first step. With clarity, protection, and support, survivors can move steadily toward a life that is quieter, safer, and finally their own.
Chapter 32. Stay Neutral. The Gray Rock Method. There are moments when walking away completely is simply not possible. Perhaps there are children to co-parent, shared work responsibilities, or family ties that cannot be caught without serious consequences. In situations like these, survivors of narcissistic behavior often need a way to protect themselves while remaining present. This is where a quiet and carefully practiced approach known as the gray rock method comes into play. The idea behind the gray rock method is surprisingly simple. You make yourself as emotionally uninteresting as a plain gray stone lying on the ground. Not cold, not hostile, not confrontational, but neutral. The goal is not to win an argument or prove a point. The goal is to stop providing what the narcissist seeks most, emotional reactions, also known as narcissistic supply. Narcissists thrive on emotional energy. Anger, tears, defensiveness, excitement, and even explanations can all feed the dynamic. When those reactions disappear, the interaction loses its fuel. Gray rock responses are intentionally bland, factual, and emotionally flat. When provoked, the response does not rise to the bait. It does not escalate, defend, or explain more than necessary. Imagine a familiar situation. A narcissist might accuse you of something deeply emotional, perhaps saying that you are ruining the children's lives or deliberately causing harm. In the past, this might have triggered a surge of anxiety or a long attempt to justify yourself. With gray rock, the response remains calm and minimal. You acknowledge the statement without engaging emotionally and then return to the practical matter at hand, something like calmly stating the pickup time without addressing the accusation itself. There is no argument to latch onto, no emotional reaction to exploit. Over time, this lack of emotional engagement changes the dynamic. Psychology today has described gray rock as acting like a dull, unemotional person. By remaining emotionally detached, the narcissist's attempts to provoke are weakened. Without drama or reaction, the interaction becomes unrewarding for them. However, this process is rarely smooth at first. When a narcissist realizes that their usual tactics are no longer working, they may temporarily escalate their behavior. This is known as an extinction burst, a term borrowed from behavioral psychology. It refers to the brief increase in intensity that occurs when a previously effective behavior stops producing results. The narcissist may provoke more aggressively, accuse more harshly, or seek stronger reactions in an attempt to restore the old dynamic. This phase can be unsettling, especially if you are not expecting it. Understanding that this escalation is temporary can help you stay grounded. If the gray rock approach is applied consistently, the extinction burst typically fades. When the narcissist no longer receives emotional supply, they often lose interest and begin looking elsewhere for stimulation. In everyday practice, gray rock means keeping communication short, factual, and emotionally neutral. Responses may be brief and practical. Sometimes it involves a simple nod, a neutral "I see," or a polite acknowledgement without further comment. It may also mean appearing busy or disengaged, not to deceive, but to limit opportunities for emotional entanglement. Eye contact is minimal, tone is even, and there is nothing controversial offered that could invite conflict. This method can be used in many settings where contact cannot be avoided, including workplaces, shared parenting arrangements, or family ties that cannot be cut without serious consequences. It is important to remember that gray rock is a defensive strategy. It is not a solution meant to last forever, and it does not change the narcissist's personality. Instead, it helps create emotional safety until distance or a fuller exit becomes possible. Practiced with consistency and patience, it can reduce daily stress and restore a sense of inner calm. As you reflect on this approach, it may help to think of gray rock not as becoming less human, but as becoming more intentional. You choose when and where your emotions are shared. You protect your peace quietly, without confrontation, allowing calm and steadiness to replace constant reactivity. In doing so, you take a meaningful step toward reclaiming control over your inner world, even when the outer circumstances remain challenging. Chapter 33. Respond Smartly. The BIFF Approach. When communication cannot be avoided, especially in writing, even a single message can become a source of stress. An email, a text, or a shared parenting message can arrive late at night and instantly pull the mind back into conflict. For many survivors of narcissistic behavior, written communication becomes one of the last remaining pathways through which control and provocation are attempted. This is why a clear, steady approach to writing back is so important. One widely used method for handling these situations is known as the BIFF response. It was developed by Bill Eddy, a lawyer and conflict resolution specialist who has worked extensively with high-conflict personalities. BIFF is designed specifically for moments when emotions run high, but contact cannot be completely cut off. At its heart, the BIFF method is about containment. It keeps communication focused, calm, and closed. Each response is intentionally structured to prevent escalation and to protect the person writing it from being pulled into an endless exchange. A BIFF response begins by being brief. The message is short and to the point. There are no long explanations, no emotional backstory, and no effort to justify past decisions. This is important because explanations often become openings for attack. The shorter the message, the fewer places there are for the other person to latch onto and argue with. The message is also informative. It sticks to facts rather than opinions. Times, dates, locations, and agreements are stated clearly, without commentary or emotional framing. Instead of responding to accusations or tone, the response addresses only the practical issue at hand. For example, rather than defending yourself against an angry message, a BIFF response might simply restate what was already agreed upon, such as when and where a meeting will take place. Even though the message is brief and factual, it remains friendly in tone. This does not mean warm or emotionally open. It means polite and professional. Simple phrases like "thank you" or a courteous closing help prevent the narcissist from framing themselves as a victim of hostility. A neutral, civil tone reduces the chance of further provocation and keeps the exchange grounded in professionalism rather than emotion. Finally, a BIFF response is firm. It clearly ends the conversation. There are no open-ended questions, no invitations for debate, and no emotional hooks left dangling. The message delivers the necessary information and then stops. By doing so, it closes the door on further argument rather than leaving it slightly open for the conflict to continue. One of the key purposes of BIFF is to prevent what is known as the JADE cycle. JADE stands for justify, argue, defend, and explain. These are natural human impulses when we feel misunderstood or accused. But with a narcissistic or high-conflict personality, JADE responses almost always intensify the situation. Each explanation becomes something to dispute. Each defense becomes another accusation. BIFF interrupts this cycle by refusing to participate in it at all. Legal professionals often recommend BIFF because it keeps written communication clear, calm, and appropriate for documentation if needed. Messages written this way tend to be legally sound and difficult to misinterpret. More importantly, they remove much of the emotional material that narcissists use to prolong conflict. Over time, when BIFF is used consistently, many narcissists begin to lose interest. Without emotional reactions or prolonged exchanges, their attempts to provoke no longer deliver the response they seek. While this does not change their underlying behavior, it often reduces the intensity and frequency of attacks. The BIFF method works especially well alongside the gray rock approach. While gray rock manages tone and presence in verbal or in-person interactions, BIFF provides a clear structure for written communication. Together, they form a quiet, steady way of navigating unavoidable contact without absorbing emotional harm. As you think about written communication in your own life, it may help to remember that not every message deserves a full emotional response. Sometimes the most peaceful reply is the one that is calm, factual, and complete. In choosing clarity over conflict and firmness over explanation, BIFF allows you to protect your energy and maintain your boundaries, one message at a time.
Chapter 34. Finding Peace. Why No Contact Works.
As the day winds down and the mind grows quieter, it can be helpful to talk about what true healing sometimes requires. When it comes to narcissistic abuse, many survivors search for the right words, the final conversation, or the moment that will bring clarity and peace. But over time, clinicians and survivors alike have reached a difficult and steady conclusion. The most reliable path to recovery is something called no contact. No contact means fully severing ties with the narcissist. It involves blocking phone numbers, email addresses, and social media accounts. It means avoiding shared spaces when possible, stepping back from mutual friends who carry messages, and removing physical reminders that keep the emotional connection alive. This approach is often described as the gold standard in recovery, not because it is easy, but because it is effective. It is important to understand what no contact truly is. It is not a punishment aimed at the narcissist. It is not an act of revenge or cruelty. Instead, it functions like a form of emotional quarantine. Just as the body needs separation from a toxin in order to heal, the mind and nervous system need distance from a source of ongoing psychological harm. Narcissistic abuse creates what is known as a trauma bond. This bond forms through cycles of affection and harm, reward and withdrawal, which affect brain chemistry in powerful ways. Over time, the nervous system becomes accustomed to the highs and lows, much like an addiction. No contact allows this cycle to stop. Without new stimulation from the abuser, the brain slowly begins to recalibrate. Emotional patterns soften. Thoughts become clearer. The constant sense of anticipation and anxiety gradually fades. Many survivors hope for closure through conversation. They want accountability, understanding, or an apology that finally makes sense of what they endured. Unfortunately, with narcissistic personalities, closure in that form rarely exists. Accountability threatens their self-image, and responsibility is consistently deflected. No contact becomes the way survivors give closure to themselves. It is the decision to stop waiting for validation from someone who cannot offer it. Experts widely endorse no contact as the optimal strategy for healing. Mental health professionals note that continued interaction with a narcissistic abuser almost always results in renewed pain. Even brief or seemingly neutral contact can reopen emotional wounds, reignite hope, or trigger old patterns of self-doubt. Each interaction keeps the trauma bond alive. The beginning of no contact is often the hardest part. Survivors frequently describe it as deeply painful, even excruciating. Feelings of grief, loneliness, and longing can surface with unexpected intensity. Some compare it to withdrawal from a substance. This reaction is not a sign that no contact is wrong. It is a sign that the nervous system is detoxing from a harmful attachment. The discomfort is real, but it is also temporary. During this period, maintaining zero contact is essential. It creates the mental space needed to process the trauma both emotionally and cognitively. Without ongoing manipulation or mixed messages, survivors can finally begin to see the relationship clearly. Memories reorganize,
Self-blame loosens its grip. The constant internal noise created by the abuser slowly quiets. As time passes, something subtle but profound often happens. Without the narcissist's influence, the survivor's true self begins to re-emerge. Preferences return. Confidence grows in small, steady ways. Decisions feel less fraught. Many people report reduced anxiety and a renewed sense of clarity. One counselor described this stage as the moment when survivors reclaim their self-worth, no longer having it chipped away by constant criticism or control. Of course, there are situations where complete no contact is not fully possible, such as when children are involved. In these cases, therapists strongly advise minimizing engagement as much as possible and using strategies like Grey Rock and BIFF to keep interactions brief, factual, and emotionally neutral. These techniques help preserve the protective boundary that no contact is meant to create. In the end, no contact is not about erasing the past, it is about protecting the future. Though it can feel wrenching at first, it provides the silence necessary for healing to begin. In that quiet space, survivors often rediscover their own inner voice, one that was drowned out for far too long. And with time, that voice grows steadier, calmer, and more confident, guiding them toward a life that feels safe, grounded, and fully their own.
Chapter 35. Embracing Reality. Radical Acceptance. As the night grows quieter and thoughts begin to slow, it becomes possible to sit with truths that once felt unbearable. One of the most important turning points in healing from narcissistic abuse is a process known as radical acceptance. This is not a moment of sudden relief or emotional comfort. It is a gradual cognitive shift, one that changes how the survivor relates to reality itself. Radical acceptance begins when the struggle against what is finally ends. It is the clear and steady realization that the narcissist is who they are. They are not misunderstood, they are not temporarily lost, they are not secretly capable of empathy if only the right words are found. This person cannot change in the way the survivor hoped. Coming to terms with that truth is painful, but it is also deeply freeing. For many survivors, much of the suffering comes from trying to fix the unfixable. There is a persistent hope that this time will be different, that the explanation will finally land, that compassion will suddenly appear. Radical acceptance gently brings that cycle to a close. It releases the survivor from the exhausting work of trying to make sense of behavior that is rooted in a lack of empathy. Instead of directing energy outward toward the abuser, that energy can finally be turned inward, toward protection and healing. In psychology, radical acceptance is a mindfulness-based coping skill that comes from dialectical behavior therapy, often called DBT. It encourages fully acknowledging reality as it is, especially the parts that are painful, without judgment. Acceptance here does not mean approval. It does not excuse the abuse or minimize its harm. It simply recognizes that what happened cannot be undone, and that fighting the past only deepens suffering. Within the context of narcissistic abuse, radical acceptance means letting go of fantasies that keep the trauma bond alive. Thoughts like, "but they were loving at the beginning," or "maybe they will understand one day," are understandable, but they often prolong emotional pain. Acceptance allows the survivor to say, quietly and honestly, that the abuse happened, that it was real, and that it had nothing to do with their worth. DBT research and clinical practice emphasize that resisting reality intensifies emotional pain. When the mind constantly revisits "if only" or "why did this happen," it stays trapped in a loop that cannot resolve. Radical acceptance interrupts that loop.
It allows the survivor to acknowledge the trauma as an irreversible fact and then shift focus to what can be controlled in the present moment. This shift often brings an unexpected sense of relief. Anger may soften, not because the abuse was acceptable, but because the survivor no longer feels compelled to relive it in search of answers. Self-blame begins to loosen as well. With acceptance comes the understanding that surviving manipulation does not make someone foolish or weak, it makes them human. Over time, radical acceptance helps transform overwhelming grief into something more manageable. The pain does not vanish, but it becomes less consuming. Survivors often find they can hold their story without being defined by it. This creates space for post-traumatic growth, where resilience, insight, and self-compassion slowly take root. Another quiet gift of radical acceptance is self-forgiveness. Many survivors carry guilt for staying too long or missing red flags. Acceptance helps them see that they were not complicit in their own abuse. They acted with the information and emotional capacity they had at the time. Compassion for the self replaces harsh judgment. Ultimately, radical acceptance is not about giving up, it is about stabilizing. It stops the emotional bleeding so that deeper recovery work can begin from a place of calm and clarity. By surrendering the fight against reality, survivors reclaim their strength. In that stillness, healing becomes not only possible, but sustainable, allowing the mind and heart to rest, even after everything they have endured.
Chapter 36. Gentle Trauma Healing, EMDR, and Somatic Therapy. As the body begins to rest and the mind grows quieter, it can be helpful to understand why some wounds linger even after we have left harmful situations behind. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse find that insight alone is not enough. They understand what happened, they can explain it clearly, and yet their body still reacts with fear, tension, or sudden emotional waves. This is because trauma is not held only in thoughts. It is also stored in the nervous system. Traditional talk therapies, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, often focus on beliefs, reasoning, and reframing thoughts. These approaches can be helpful, but for many survivors of chronic emotional abuse, they do not reach the deepest layers of trauma. Narcissistic abuse is repetitive, unpredictable, and often subtle. Over time, the body learns to stay on high alert. Even when the danger is gone, the nervous system may still behave as if it is not safe. This is where trauma-focused therapies like EMDR and somatic experiencing can be especially helpful. These approaches work not only with words and logic, but also with the brain and the body, allowing healing to occur at a deeper, quieter level. EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing, is a well-supported therapy for trauma and post-traumatic stress. It is based on the idea that traumatic memories can become stuck in the brain in an unprocessed form. When this happens, reminders of the trauma can trigger intense emotional and physical reactions, as if the event were happening again. During EMDR, a trained therapist gently guides the survivor to recall distressing memories while engaging in bilateral stimulation. This often involves moving the eyes back and forth, or sometimes tapping or auditory cues that alternate from one side to the other. This process helps the brain resume its natural ability to process and integrate memories. Over time, the emotional charge attached to these memories begins to soften. Flashbacks may decrease. The memory remains, but it no longer overwhelms the nervous system. Survivors often describe this as being able to remember what happened without being pulled back into it. Painful experiences become part of a coherent life story rather than isolated fragments that erupt unexpectedly.
Clinicians have observed that EMDR can help survivors replace deeply ingrained negative beliefs, such as shame or self-blame, with more compassionate and realistic self-understanding. The trauma is not erased, but it becomes more digestible. Research supports EMDR's effectiveness in helping the brain integrate traumatic memories and restore a sense of emotional balance. Somatic experiencing, often called SE, takes a slightly different but complementary approach. It focuses on the body's physical responses to trauma, rather than the story alone. This method is based on the understanding that during abuse, the natural fight or flight response is often interrupted. When escape or resistance is not possible, the body may enter a freeze state. That frozen energy can remain stored in muscles, posture, and breathing patterns long after the threat has passed. In somatic experiencing, the therapist helps the survivor gently notice bodily sensations such as tension, shallow breathing, or subtle trembling. Rather than reliving the trauma in detail, the focus stays in the present moment physical awareness. Slowly and carefully, the body is allowed to complete the responses it could not finish at the time of the abuse. This might look like releasing held breath, allowing small movements, or noticing warmth or relaxation spreading through the body. These changes may seem subtle, but they are meaningful. Early studies suggest that somatic experiencing can reduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress by helping the nervous system return to a state of regulation and safety. Both EMDR and somatic experiencing share an important principle. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means changing the relationship to what happened. The memories become quieter. The body learns that the danger has passed. Emotional reactions lose their sharp edges. In practice, these therapies are often used alongside talk therapy. Cognitive approaches can help address beliefs and meaning, while EMDR and somatic experiencing work with the deeper imprints left in the nervous system. Together, they support a more complete form of healing, one that includes both understanding and felt safety. For survivors of narcissistic abuse, this integrated approach can be especially powerful. It acknowledges that the pain was real, that it affected both mind and body, and that recovery is not about forcing strength, but about gently restoring calm. As you settle into rest, it may be comforting to know that healing does not require reliving every detail or explaining yourself perfectly. Sometimes healing happens quietly, through steady support, patient attention, and therapies that allow the body and brain to do what they were always meant to do: process, release, and return to balance.
Chapter 37. Reuniting Your Inner Self. Internal Family Systems.
As the mind begins to slow and the day softens into quiet, it can be comforting to remember that healing does not require becoming someone new. Often, it simply asks us to listen more carefully to what is already inside. One therapy that approaches healing in this gentle and respectful way is called Internal Family Systems, often known as IFS. Internal Family Systems is built on the idea that the mind is not a single unified voice, but a natural system made up of different inner parts. These parts are not signs of damage or weakness. They are normal responses to life experiences, especially to trauma. For survivors of narcissistic abuse, this understanding can feel deeply validating. In this model, some parts carry pain. These are often called exiles. They may hold feelings of shame, fear, grief, or abandonment, often dating back to moments when the survivor felt unseen, blamed, or emotionally unsafe. These parts are usually pushed out of awareness because their pain feels overwhelming. Other parts develop to protect the system,
A survivor might have a manager part that tries to be perfect, hyper-responsible, or endlessly accommodating in order to prevent criticism or rejection. There may also be parts that react with anger, withdrawal, or emotional numbness. These protective responses are not flaws, they are strategies the mind created to survive an unsafe environment. IFS therapy helps survivors gently identify these inner parts and begin to relate to them with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment. Instead of trying to silence or override these parts, the therapist guides the survivor in learning what each part is trying to do and why it exists. For example, an angry part may have developed to guard against further mistreatment. Rather than seeing this anger as a problem, IFS invites appreciation for its protective role. Once that part feels understood and respected, it often becomes willing to soften its grip, allowing deeper emotions to surface safely. At the center of this process is what IFS calls the self. The self is not another part. It is the calm, compassionate, grounded awareness that exists beneath the layers of protection and pain. Even survivors who feel fragmented or self-critical still have access to this self. IFS works to restore the self to a leadership role within the inner system. As protective parts begin to trust the self, they allow the survivor to connect with exiled parts, often experienced as wounded inner children. Through this process, survivors learn how to offer care, validation, and safety to these younger parts. Clinicians often describe this as a form of reparenting, where the survivor becomes a steady and compassionate presence for themselves. This approach can be especially powerful for healing the fragmentation and self-loathing that narcissistic conditioning teaches people to turn against their own feelings, to distrust their instincts, and to measure their worth through others' approval. IFS gently reverses this pattern by fostering inner cooperation rather than inner conflict. When the parts are no longer fighting each other, many survivors report a growing sense of wholeness. Self-compassion becomes more natural, emotional reactions feel less extreme and more understandable. Instead of feeling hijacked by anger, fear, or shame, survivors begin to feel curious about their inner experiences. Research on IFS is still emerging, but early findings are encouraging. Group studies have shown significant reductions in trauma symptoms, with a substantial number of participants no longer meeting diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress after IFS interventions. Clinicians increasingly recognize IFS as a non-shaming and empowering approach, particularly well-suited to survivors of relational trauma. What makes internal family systems especially gentle is that it never asks survivors to force change. There is no pressure to get rid of parts or to rush healing. Each part is welcomed, listened to, and gradually relieved of the burdens it has been carrying alone. As you rest, it may be soothing to reflect on this idea. Inside you is not chaos, but a system that adapted to survive. With patience and care, those inner voices can begin to work together again. In that quiet cooperation, many survivors rediscover something they feared was lost, a steady sense of self, capable of compassion, clarity, and deep inner peace.
Chapter 38. Calming the Storm. Dialectical Behavior Therapy. As the evening settles and the pace of the day finally slows, it can be comforting to reflect on how emotional storms begin to calm when we are given the right tools. For many survivors of narcissistic abuse, emotions do not simply pass through gently. They surge, overwhelm, and linger. Dialectical behavior therapy, often called DBT, was developed to help people navigate exactly these kinds of inner experiences.
DBT was originally designed to support individuals with borderline personality disorder, but over time it has proven highly effective for people living with complex post-traumatic stress, including survivors of chronic emotional abuse. Its strength lies in its practicality. Rather than focusing only on insight or analysis, DBT teaches concrete skills for living through intense emotional moments with greater stability. At its core, DBT is organized around 4 key skill areas: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. Together, these skills help survivors understand their emotions, survive moments of crisis, and interact with others in ways that protect their well-being. Mindfulness is often the foundation. In DBT, mindfulness does not mean emptying the mind or forcing calm. Instead, it teaches survivors to notice thoughts, sensations, and emotions as they arise, without immediately reacting or judging themselves. For someone healing from narcissistic abuse, this can be especially powerful. Flashbacks, intrusive memories, or waves of shame may still appear, but mindfulness helps create a small pause. In that pause, the survivor learns that having a painful thought does not mean they must act on it or believe it. Distress tolerance skills are designed for moments when emotions feel unbearable. These are the times when anger spikes, anxiety floods the body, or despair feels overwhelming. DBT offers techniques such as paced breathing, grounding, and self-soothing to help the nervous system settle. These skills do not erase pain, but they make it survivable. They allow the body to ride out emotional intensity without causing additional harm. Emotion regulation skills help bring clarity to what once felt chaotic. Survivors often describe emotions as confusing or explosive, especially after long periods of gaslighting or emotional invalidation. DBT teaches people how to identify and name emotions accurately. When emotions are labeled and understood, they tend to feel less frightening and more manageable. Over time, this skill helps reduce sudden mood swings and emotional exhaustion. Interpersonal effectiveness focuses on how survivors relate to others in the present. Narcissistic abuse often trains people to ignore their own needs, fear conflict, or feel guilty for setting boundaries. DBT provides structured ways to communicate clearly and assertively. Learning how to say no, how to ask for what is needed, and how to maintain self-respect in relationships can feel transformative. These skills help survivors rebuild trust in their own voice. One of the most important principles in DBT is its dialectical approach, which means holding 2 truths at the same time. DBT emphasizes accepting reality as it is while also working toward meaningful change. This balance closely aligns with the concept of radical acceptance. Survivors learn that accepting what happened does not mean approving of it. Acceptance simply creates the emotional stability needed to move forward. Although research specifically focused on DBT for narcissistic abuse survivors is still developing, many trauma-focused programs adapt DBT skills for complex trauma and chronic abuse. Clinicians frequently report improvements in emotional stability, sleep quality, and overall distress management. For survivors who struggle with intense emotional reactions, DBT's structure can feel grounding and reassuring. In practice, DBT often involves creating personalized coping plans. Therapists may use worksheets or exercises to help survivors apply skills in daily life. Over time, these tools become familiar, almost like emotional muscle memory, available when stress or triggers arise. As the day fades into night, it may be soothing to remember that emotional intensity is not a personal failure. It is a natural response to prolonged harm. Dialectical behavior therapy does not ask survivors to suppress their feelings. Instead, it teaches them how to hold those feelings gently, respond with care, and build a life that feels more balanced and safe. In learning these skills, survivors often discover something quietly powerful. They are no longer at the mercy of every emotional wave. With patience and practice, they gain the ability to steady themselves even after everything they've been through.
Chapter 39. Reclaiming Your Freedom. Growing After Trauma. As the night settles in and the world grows quieter, it becomes possible to look ahead rather than only back. Healing from narcissistic abuse is not simply about returning to who you were before. In many cases, that version of life no longer exists. Something has been dismantled along the way. And yet within that loss lies an unexpected possibility. Recovery often becomes a process of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is a well-established concept in psychology. It describes how people, after enduring profound adversity, may develop new strengths, deeper self-awareness, and a clearer sense of meaning. This does not mean the trauma was necessary or beneficial. It means that through grappling with what happened, survivors sometimes emerge with a life that is more authentic than the one they lived before. For survivors of narcissistic abuse, this stage often begins with reclaiming autonomy. During the relationship, personal choices may have been slowly erased. Intuition was questioned. Passions were minimized. Values were overridden. Leaving requires dismantling an entire way of living, but in that empty space, there is room to rebuild. This rebuilding process involves rediscovering what genuinely matters to you. Survivors often find themselves reconnecting with interests that were once discouraged or dismissed. Creativity returns, curiosity awakens, simple preferences begin to feel meaningful again. Choosing what to eat, where to go, or how to spend time becomes an act of quiet empowerment. Equally important is the gradual restoration of trust in oneself. Narcissistic abuse teaches people to doubt their perceptions and instincts. Post-traumatic growth reverses this pattern. Survivors learn to listen inwardly again. Decisions are made based on personal values rather than fear of conflict or disapproval. Over time, confidence grows not from external validation, but from consistency with one's own truth. Psychological research on post-traumatic growth highlights several common areas of change. Many survivors report increased resilience and emotional strength. Relationships often become more authentic as tolerance for manipulation or superficiality fades. There is frequently a deeper appreciation for life, even in its quieter moments. Some people feel drawn to help others, becoming advocates or sources of support for those walking similar paths. In therapy, this stage may involve setting goals that reflect the survivor's liberated self rather than the identity shaped by abuse. This could mean pursuing a new career, returning to education, or simply creating a daily life that feels calm and self-directed. Establishing firm boundaries becomes natural rather than forced. Decisions are guided by personal needs and values, not by anticipation of someone else's reaction. Many survivors describe a powerful shift when they realize they are once again the author of their own life. Even small acts, like speaking honestly or ending lingering legal or emotional entanglements, can feel monumental. Clinicians often encourage acknowledging these milestones not as grand achievements, but as evidence of reclaimed agency. As this process unfolds, language itself may begin to change. Survivors often move from seeing themselves as victims to recognizing themselves as survivors. With time, some arrive at a deeper place still,
becoming thrivers. This does not mean the past is forgotten. It means the past no longer defines the present. The ultimate victory over a narcissist is not confrontation or revenge. It is indifference. It is a life lived fully, where joy, choice, and autonomy take center stage. In this life, the narcissist is no longer the protagonist. They become a distant chapter, no longer shaping the narrative. Post-traumatic growth reminds us that suffering, while deeply painful, does not have the final word. Over time, adversity can become the ground from which wisdom grows. Healing becomes both a process and an outcome, as survivors find new meaning, deeper self-respect, and a steady sense of belonging within themselves. As you rest, it may be comforting to hold this thought gently. What was broken can be rebuilt, not as it was, but as something truer. And in that rebuilding, many survivors discover a quiet strength they did not know they had, guiding them toward a life that feels free, grounded, and unmistakably their own.
Chapter 40. Escaping the Maze, a Final Reflection.
As we come to the end of this journey, it feels fitting to slow down and take a quiet look at the path we have just walked. Narcissism, as we have seen, is often described as a labyrinth of mirrors. It is a complex and deeply rooted pattern that traps not only the individual who lives within it, but also those who come too close. Everywhere there are reflections, distortions, and illusions, yet very little genuine connection. From ancient myths to modern psychology and neuroscience, one theme appears again and again. When true connection is absent, something essential is lost. For the narcissist, the tragedy is profound. Their life becomes a relentless pursuit of an image, a reflection that can never fully satisfy. No matter how much admiration or validation they receive, it is never enough. The mirror always demands more. For the survivor, the story takes a different turn. Healing begins not by polishing the mirror, but by breaking it. It is the moment when the illusion finally cracks and the survivor steps out of a world shaped by manipulation and false narratives. What awaits on the other side is not perfection, but something far more grounding. It is reality, tangible, imperfect, and quietly beautiful. It is the rediscovery of the self as it truly is. Throughout this exploration, we have traced narcissistic pathology across many layers. We began with myth and symbolism, moved through psychoanalytic theory and behavioral research, and explored how narcissism plays out in families, workplaces, and intimate relationships. We examined the nervous system, trauma responses, and the therapeutic paths that help survivors heal. The picture that emerges is complex and multifaceted. Narcissism is not a surface-level personality quirk. It is rooted in deep insecurity, often shaped by early attachment wounds and unresolved trauma. To survive, the narcissistic personality builds elaborate defenses and interpersonal strategies that protect a fragile inner world. These strategies may appear confident or grand, but they are driven by fear and disconnection. At the same time, survivors are not damaged because they trusted, loved, or hoped. Modern trauma-informed understanding makes this clear. Abuse by a narcissist is not a failure of perception or strength on the part of the victim. It is an interpersonal violation that can lead to real psychological harm, including symptoms comparable to post-traumatic stress. Recognizing this truth lifts a heavy burden of self-blame. Current research continues to deepen our understanding. Neuroscience is exploring how reward systems in the brain respond to narcissistic supply. Personality researchers are refining models that distinguish healthy confidence from pathological entitlement.
Clinicians are increasingly integrating approaches, combining psychodynamic insight, cognitive tools, and somatic therapies to address both the mind and the body. This integrated perspective reflects a growing awareness that healing must be holistic. At the heart of recovery is the restoration of safety and self-coherence. Survivors heal when their nervous system calms, when their inner world becomes integrated again, and when empathy is reintroduced, first towards themselves. While the effects of narcissistic abuse can be long-lasting, the outlook is not bleak. Many survivors go on to experience post-traumatic growth. They develop stronger boundaries, clearer values, and a deeper sense of autonomy. Some even discover a renewed sense of purpose, shaped by wisdom rather than pain. Looking ahead, continued research remains essential, especially into long-term outcomes and the most effective interventions for survivors. Public awareness is equally important. When narcissistic abuse is named and understood for what it is, more people are able to seek help sooner, and fewer are left alone in confusion and self-doubt. In the end, both narcissism and recovery resemble a maze. The turns are complex, and the path is rarely straight. But understanding each twist, each illusion, and each hidden passage makes escape possible. Knowledge becomes the tool that cuts through manipulation, loosens its grip, and opens the way forward. As this chapter closes, it may be comforting to remember this. Stepping out of the maze does not require becoming someone else. It requires coming home to who you have always been. And in that quiet return, beyond the mirrors and illusions, there is space for clarity, connection, and a life that feels real again.